Howdy, my totally as always tubular gamers, and we're back with, you guessed it, another ranking video. But today's not just any ranking video, today is the ranking video. Today is one of the biggest ranking videos I have ever made and will ever make. And that ranking is every game by Rockstar Games. Yep, every single one. We looked at all the games they put out in the 2000s. We looked at all the games they put out in the 2010s. We're putting them together, adding some from the 90s. We're doing every single game here. Now, Rockstar Games themselves, they really don't need an introduction from me. You already know who they are. GTA, Red Dead, Midnight Club, Manhunt, Bully, Warriors, more GTA. To say that they're one of the biggest game companies to ever grace the industry would be an understatement. Nowadays, they don't exactly make a ton of games, but over the years, over the couple decades that they've been in now, they have put out tons upon tons of games. And while they didn't develop all of the games on this list, their logo was on so many of these games. And really that leads me to the criteria for this list. We're going to be looking at every single game that has the Rockstar Games logo. It doesn't matter if they developed it, if they published it, if they just sent one QA tester to the studio to help them. If their logo is on any version of this game, it's going to be on the list. Even if it was, like, say, released on PC and it was put out by a different publisher. If the PS2 version has the Rockstar Games logo on it, it's on this list. We also won't be including any games by Rockstar North's old name DMA Design, so no lemmings here. Everything has to be by Rockstar Games. But I promise you, one day DMA Design will have their own ranking video as well, because there's a lot of good games there. We're going to be ranking these games based off pretty much everything, my personal preference, how the games have aged. Really, it's just my personal preference. There really is no definitive list. There's so many games with so many varying levels of quality that it's just impossible for two people to have the exact same list. So I'd love to know your list down below. Also, if a game has different versions, I'm going to combine all the versions into one entry. So there's only going to be one GTA 5 here, there's only going to be one Midnight Club 3 here. Now, I've talked about pretty much all of these games at some point over the last month or two, and so if you've seen those old videos, you might be a little familiar here. Now, let me know down below your favorite Rockstar games, like, share, comment, sub, all that good stuff. Really, let's just get to this massive undertaking. What do I think is the worst game of them all? Well, I wouldn't actually say that this is the worst game Rockstar Games has ever put out. This is just kind of at the bottom by default and more of an honorable mention. Which was a music mixer released in 2009 by Rockstar Leeds in collaboration with Timbaland. It really is just a music mixer. I'm not someone who makes music, I make videos. The game was also released on iOS, but that version's not up, and the game's online services have been shut down, so it really is just kind of a basic music mixer. And I mean, I'll be real, you could download hundreds of programs to do this. You don't need a PSP game to do this. I'm sure this was probably ahead of its time, but yeah, just kind of by default it's at the bottom since it's not really a game. Again, I don't have any experience with this. I just know that if I didn't include it on this list, there'd be that one person in the comments saying I miss Beta Raider, so here's Beta Raider. Not really much of a game. It was before the SoundCloud rapper scene, but there you go. Alright, so for this entry we got a double feature. We got two Austin Powers games, Austin Powers Oh Behave and Austin Powers Welcome to My Underground Lair, both released for the Game Boy Color on the same day in 2000, and both were by Tarantula Studios, and of course were published by Rockstar Games. Tarantula Studios actually made the Grand Theft Auto Game Boy Color port and the Evel Knievel game. Now, even though these are two different games, I put them together since they're pretty similar. They came out the same day, they came out on the same console, they're both really just mini game collections, and they're both ass. It doesn't matter if they're together or if they're apart, these are the worst games that Rockstar Games' name is attached to from the 2000s, and it's one of the worst games that Rockstar Games has ever published. Now, I love Austin Powers. I love all three of the movies. I think they're all hilarious. They're all great watches, and the music is great in all of them. But these games do not capture anything that made Austin Powers great at all. I mean, they have some attempts at humor and some quirkiness, but they just all fall flat on their face. And like I said like 30 seconds ago, these are just minigame collections. These games actually share minigames also. They have the same games in them. There's like a Pac-Man styled minigame, there's like a board game, there's a rock, paper, scissors game, and Austin Powers Oh Behave actually has one called International Man and Platform Game, which is like a platformer. These minigames are trash. They all control terribly, they're boring, they just don't have a lot going on, they're poorly developed, and there's not much to them. You play them for 30 seconds, maybe 2 or 3 minutes at most, and you've seen it all. Like, there's just really not a lot to go off of here. It's a terrible Game Boy game and just a horrible movie tie-in. Like, it's very clearly it was just a movie tie-in to make a quick buck, and there's just not much to it. These games really lack any passion or soul or creativity. There's just nothing here. These are terrible games that I do not recommend, even for Austin Powers enthusiasts like myself. Yeah, no, this is just bad. And so here's that Evel Knievel game I was talking about, developed by Tarantula Studios and put out by Rockstar Games in 1999 for the Game Boy Color. Evel Knievel is based off of the legendary stuntman Evel Knievel, the guy who was on his motorcycle who would do these insane jumps. So naturally a game, yeah, it doesn't seem like too far-fetched of a concept. And the game here on the Game Boy, well, it's basically a 2D platformer. You know, as I was trying this and taking a look at it, I really immediately realized that this is like a precursor to the Trials games by Ubisoft. If you're familiar with Trials, like Trials Evolution HD or Rising, where it's a 2D obstacle course basically for you on your motorcycle. This plays very similar to that. It really did come before and is the OG Trials. Unfortunately, it's not very good either. With it being on the Game Boy, obviously I don't expect anything as crazy as, say, Trials, even the first Trials game, but this is just incredibly basic. You go point A to B, just kind of lifting your motorcycle up to get through the obstacle course, and it doesn't exactly control all that well. It is very clunky, and then the game is seriously like 45 minutes. The game's levels really aren't too interesting. There isn't a ton to go off of here. I mean, you get to do some big jumps and you do some basic platforming with the bike, but again, there's really just not that much to talk about. There doesn't seem to be much online about this game. There's not even a Wikipedia page. And I think the reason is there's just not that much to this game, especially after trying it. It's like there's just really not a lot to go off of here. It's a very bog standard, like mediocre platformer at best that isn't obviously worth playing. I mean, it's better than those Austin Powers games, but yeah, it's just not even worth playing and just a footnote in Rockstar's history. Our next game is actually a PS2 launch title. This is Surfing H3O, developed by Opus and put out by Rockstar in 2000. This is, if you couldn't tell, a surfing game. Now, when it comes to surfing games, the only real surfing game experience I have is with Kelly Slater Pro Surfer by Treyarch. That game was pretty fun, but it was just kind of a Tony Hawk Pro Skater clone, and it was limited to just surfing. But honestly, this game makes that game look great, because Surfing H3O, well, this just isn't it, Chief. This is not a very good game. It's pretty simple, and there's just not a lot going on here. This is supposed to be a pretty by-the-numbers, lame extreme sports game, but it's really not even that, as I'd really rather play almost any other extreme sports game. The biggest issue with this game is the controls. The controls are just a pain in the ass. They're incredibly clunky, stiff, and pushing in the analog sticks on a PS2 controller has just never been a good idea for like any game, let alone that being really important to the control. Now, the controls are super finicky, they just aren't precise enough, and they just feel really cumbersome. I had a ton of wipeouts because I was just fighting the controls, and then when you actually try to get decent at the controls, you realize there's really not much game here. There's like a tournament mode where you just kind of do tricks and go to the buoy and then kind of finish up. At least the music is pretty good. The music is what you'd expect for a game like this, and you know, I like it. It's that early 2000s, late 90s kind of punk rockish vibe. I like that. I can dig that. But I mean, nice music aside, there just really isn't much to the game. There's a multiplayer mode. There's some different characters. And yeah, you just kind of surf. It's like you go on the wave, you go to the buoy, you go back. I mean, there's really not all that much to it. And you know, for a game that takes place exclusively on the water, you would think it would look better. At least Pro Surfer looked pretty decent. I don't recommend really anybody plays any surfing game, especially nowadays, but you really don't want to play this one. I have no idea what Rockstar was thinking publishing this one. Like, it's just not really good at all. There's no reason to even try it, and I absolutely don't recommend it. So our next game is an interesting one. This is Wild Metal Country, developed by DMA Design, the old name for Rockstar Games, and it was published by Rockstar on the computer and Dreamcast in early 2000. It's also not very good. Wild Metal Country is a very obscure and just strange game to play on the Dreamcast, and really just in general, and it's kind of odd that Rockstar Games even developed this, let alone put it out at all. If you're just playing the game, there's basically no plot here at all. There's not even a setup. However, in the game's manual, and because I looked it up, there is actually a plot to this game. It's about you taking out these robots who have gone out of control, and that's pretty much it. Okay, so the story is pretty bland, but it's not just the story, the gameplay is also pretty bland. You're dropped into these big, open, dull-looking environments, you're in a tank, and you just kind of drive around destroying other robots, blowing them up, collecting these collectibles, and I guess exploring. There's really not a ton to this game in terms of gameplay. You really just drive around, blow stuff up, and collect stuff. The game really is as basic as it looks, and there's really not a lot going on here. The physics and controls are actually pretty decent, and blowing stuff up can feel nice, and I guess exploring has its moments, but this gameplay is largely uninspired and gets really boring really quickly. There's not even any music in the game. After even a short period of time, I found myself just falling asleep here. Like, yeah, it's cool, I get to blow stuff up in the tank, but there's just not really anything going on to make me care here. Like, this game just feels so lifeless and stale, and maybe that's the point since I'm fighting robots, but there's just not a lot going on here. The level design is very boring, it looks really boring, it's generally, again, very flat and bland, and there's just nothing really to the game. There's a reason it's so obscure and forgotten nowadays, because it's just really not that good, and I don't think it's worth playing at all. It's definitely a snooze fest. And here's a game I honestly thought I would never talk about at any point, and it's Earthworm Jim 3D, developed by VIS Interactive and published by Rockstar Games on the 64. Now, Earthworm Jim is a pretty beloved series of 2D platformers. These original two games are absolute classics. I've not played too much of them, but what I played I quite liked. They're very unique. Jim himself was very unique. And then they had this third game, and I've played Earthworm Jim 3D, and unfortunately over the years it definitely has gotten a very negative reception. It's generally considered one of the worst 2D to 3D transitions, along with like the Castlevania N64 games, and you know, I can definitely agree to that. This game was incredibly aged the moment it came out, let alone trying to play it in 2022. It's just kind of painful. This game is not very good. While the game does actually look pretty good for an N64 game, and it certainly has a lot of the characteristics and crazy features that the original two Earthworm Jims had, and you know, Jim himself looks great and the animation is pretty solid, the gameplay really does fall flat on its ass. This game is just incredibly clunky by pretty much every standard, whether it's the controls, the awful, and I truly mean awful camera, or just the levels in general. It feels so clunky, especially when compared to other 3D platformers on the 64, where we had so many good ones. Rayman, Banjo-Kazooie, Tooie, Mario, Kid Chameleon. There is endless great platformers on the 64 that are in 3D and that are a lot better than this game. The controls are just not satisfying. It doesn't feel good to control Jim. His moveset is still pretty solid. There just isn't a very good weight or feel behind it. It's really just not all that good. And then you also get to go after your enemies with an attack and your gun, and you know, the gun is just so clunky and awkward to use. It just feels terrible. Fighting enemies in this game is just not very good, and the bosses are just awful in this game. And did I mention that the camera is truly just awful? It is like shockingly awful. I don't expect cameras to be very good in a 64 game. I mean, Mario's wasn't even all that great, but this is just awful. One reviewer actually said that it was on a kamikaze mission to ruin the game, and you know, I think that might be pretty spot on. At least the story is pretty wacky, where it's about Jim in a coma and he's in his own subconscious, and I think this is actually pretty interesting and pretty funny. It's got a good attitude with it. And you know, it's not like the worst game on the 64. That's always going to be Superman or Carmageddon 64, but this game I absolutely do not recommend. I don't think even fans of Earthworm Jim will like this one. There's a reason we didn't really get another Jim game after this. Like, this game is just not very good. It had a pretty notorious development cycle as well, taking just forever because the developers couldn't figure out how to put this game in 3D among other issues, and yeah, it's just totally not worth playing. So here's another interesting one. Here we have Monster Truck Madness 64, put out on the 64, developed by Terminal Reality on the PC, Edge of Reality on the 64, and published by Microsoft on the computer, but it was actually published by Rockstar on the N64. So yeah, clearly a lot of names in this game, and how is it? Well, it's a monster truck racing game. You know, I actually did a ranking video on every Monster Jam game a while back, and I thought most monster truck games, at least with the Monster Jam property, were actually pretty decent. This, I would say, is not one of those games. And unfortunately, I would say this is one of the more lackluster monster truck games I've played over the years. I really walked away from this game just kind of disappointed. I mean, it being on the 64, you know, I gotta temper my expectations, but yeah, it just wasn't really a great time. Ultimately, it is a pretty standard racing game for the 64. You are in monster trucks, so everything's obviously off-road. There are a variety of different trucks here. There is some licensed ones, Gravediggers here, Bigfoot's here. There's even some WCW wrestlers that have their own trucks, which is a neat touch, and I did like that as a fan of wrestling in WCW. I did like the trucks in this game. I think the truck selection for the time was actually pretty solid and one of the better aspects. My issues with the game really come down to its courses, controls, and handling. The courses, they're just nothing really all that exciting. It is pretty basic, pretty bland. The environment doesn't exactly look amazing, and the draw distance isn't amazing either. There's just really not a lot of landmarks, and it just feels kind of generic, and so there's nothing really special going on there. And going through these isn't the most fun because of the controls and general handling. This game is just kind of all over the place with its handling. It actually suffers the same issue a lot of monster truck games face, even nowadays, where they don't really know if they want to make it a sim or an arcade experience. It just kind of falls in between and doesn't really do either very well. You would think that this is an arcade experience. It seems pretty fast. There's even items and like a boost you can get, and yeah, you go off some jumps at some decent speed. Yeah, it seems like an arcade experience, but then when you're actually controlling the truck, it definitely is more along the lines of a simulator. They just kind of roll all over the place. You really want to be careful with your turns, and I just think it doesn't make a good combination. I just did not come away satisfied with the handling of this game. I think it could have been a hell of a lot better. I've heard it's better on the PC version, and I've heard the PC version is just better in general, but I thought this was a pretty mediocre experience overall, and I really just didn't have a very good time with it, which is a shame. I love monster truck games, but, you know, I've looked at much better monster truck games in that Monster Jam ranking video, so check that out if you want to see some good ones. So our next game is Smuggler's Run, which was released for the PS2 in 2000. It was actually a launch title for the PS2. It was developed by Angel Studios, who would go on to be Rockstar San Diego, and they released it at the same time as Midnight Club 1. And you know, this game is actually very similar to the original Midnight Club. It has a very similar checkpoint-based gameplay loop. You basically drive around in this giant open area rather than on tracks, and you just go from checkpoint to checkpoint. Now, the driving in this game, it feels fine. The handling is okay when you're in a heavier car. The smaller and lighter cars just roll all over the place, but it's not the worst handling. Obviously, the key difference from Midnight Club is that it's not a city, instead it's deserts, valleys, and rivers. It's not very detailed, and it feels just kind of open and barren. I really did think that the original city of Midnight Club 1 was pretty decent. This really just doesn't stand out. The map designs are just kind of bland, flat, and there's really not all that much going on, and there's not a lot of verticality either. Like, without thinking about the game for a few minutes, I really could not tell you any of the level design of any of the areas in this game. Like, it all just kind of meshes together, and it was like in one ear, out the other. Something different from the original Midnight Club is that there's actually variety here. It's not just the checkpoint to checkpoint racing the original Midnight Club had. No, there's actually some variety. There's actually some different mission types here, like getting away from the police or, you know, being a smuggler on the run. There actually is some different missions here. Are they all that good? No, not really, but there's some variety here. The police are pretty unbearable here. They are just relentless. They will smash into you over and over and over, and it leads to a lot of trial and error because you can just get totally screwed over by the police in literal seconds to the point where you just have to start over, and it leads to you replaying missions a lot because of just some random instance of the police, and it just gets really frustrating. Combine this with the kind of shoddy handling and unpredictable physics, and you really just have a recipe for disaster here. The original Smuggler's Run, I don't really think it's all that good of a game. I mean, it wasn't like awful, and it is playable, but I just don't think anybody should play it, and I'll just be 100 here. Play any of the other Midnight Club games. They're all better than this game. And as a little side note here, the game actually had a Game Boy Advance port 2 years later by Rebellion of all companies, and this, well, this is just even worse than the actual game, so that's not going to help its case. Don't play either of these. It really shouldn't be a surprise the worst GTA on this list is GTA Advance, developed by Digital Eclipse and put out by Rockstar Games for the GBA. While it's not a terrible game, it definitely does have some issues. The game is like the first two Grand Theft Autos where it's from a top-down perspective, and of course with it being on the GBA, you gotta expect some compromises here. While it's not bad, it's very average or middling really at best. The story's alright in this game. It's a prequel to GTA 3 and takes place in Liberty City again. There's even some characters here from GTA 3 that make an appearance like 8 Ball, and that's cool, I guess. The story is pretty basic, and there's no cutscene since it's the GBA, it's just all text. Now when it comes to the actual gameplay, most of the game you really are just driving from one location to the other, or trying to escape like the cops. There is some on foot here, but the less said about the on foot, probably the better. A majority really is driving. The controls could be a lot better, as it does feel very unresponsive at times, especially in certain vehicles, and I mean, driving with the D-pad, it's going to take some time to get used to. And then when it comes to the presentation, it was just like, okay, the graphics are alright for the GBA, but it can get really stuttery, especially when you're driving at fast speeds, and that just adds to the unresponsiveness. The music is just really annoying. There is music in this game, but it does get pretty old pretty quickly, as there are no radio channels. It just plays one track the whole time you're in a certain car, which, yeah, it gets annoying. Look, I cut this game some slack because it is on the GBA, and it does have some good elements to it, but coming back all these years later, it's really not that great. And these days, I don't recommend anybody try it out, as it's just way too dated for its own good. It's more dated than, like, the original GTA games. And I don't think anybody should be playing it, especially nowadays. And here we have the original GTA, developed by DMA Design and put out by Take-Two and eventually Rockstar Games. Now coming back, original GTA all these years later, it is pretty crazy how Rockstar had a vision in mind, and really every GTA after would just build on top of this original vision. This game has pretty much everything you'd expect from a Grand Theft Auto game, it's just from a top-down perspective. It has you dropped into an open world where you can do whatever you want. There's a couple different open worlds, being Liberty City, Vice City, and San Andreas. You really can just free roam, do whatever you want, kill people, run people over, or just explore the map if you want to. And then of course you can take on missions, whether it's through the phone or through a vehicle. There is plenty of jobs to do here. Interestingly enough, this game is actually heavily point-based, as the goal for each area is to actually get so many points. You get points for pretty much everything, but the real way to get the points is by doing jobs. Something kind of funny to see is that this game actually has lives. Every level you have 5 lives, and if you lose them all, well, you're shit out of luck. So most of the game is doing these jobs, and most of the jobs are pretty simple. Usually it's just crash into someone, sell a car, kill someone, or get somewhere so fast. So most of the game is driving. The driving in this game is pretty alright. Sometimes the camera just goes absolutely nuts and zooms in and out, but for the most part, the driving is fine enough. The controls are nice, and the game has radio stations. And of course, as you commit crimes, eventually the police become more and more aware of your activities, and they'll start to hunt you down, eventually getting to the point where they will just do everything in their power to destroy you, but that's the typical Grand Theft Auto gameplay. There is also some on-foot gameplay, but like GTA Advance, the less said about this the better. I mean, it is better than GTA Advance's on-foot gameplay, but I've never thought that the on-foot gameplay was particularly strong in the first couple Grand Theft Auto games. But again, it is pretty impressive to see how Rockstar really laid the foundation for all the GTA games to come, and it's all here in the original game. The formula is there, the design is there, it's just very unrefined and a lot more simple than later games. There's also 2 expansions for it that I'm just throwing in here, London Missions, and there's also a Game Boy Color version of this game, which, I mean, you think this game is already kind of dated, you look at that Game Boy Color version. So should you try GTA 1 in the modern day? If you really want to see where the series got started, go ahead and try it. Otherwise, you can pretty much skip it. So our next game is another interesting one. It is The Italian Job, based on the 1969 film of the same name, and it was developed by Pixelogic. It was put out on the PlayStation, and it came to North American markets in 2002 by Rockstar Games. Yeah, PS1 game in '02. Now, I'll be 100 with you, I've actually never seen the original movie. I know about the reboot with Mark Wahlberg, but let's not talk about that. This game does follow the movie very closely from what I understand, and it does actually have a number of set pieces play out that are from the movie. Now, obviously, a lot of the movie is car chases or something going on in a car, so naturally this is a driving game. You spend the entire game in the car, and most of the time you are driving from point A to B, but occasionally you do have to tail someone or destroy someone, like knock them off the road or something along those lines. The driving in this game is actually pretty solid. It does feel nice. And I thought that a lot of the cars had a decent weight to them. I did notice the collision detection can be a little shoddy at times, and you just kind of get stuck on stuff like most PS1 driving games. And when you go airborne, it really can get kind of questionable, and the physics can be so-so, but also it is a PS1 driving game, so you know, I'll give it a little pass there. Now, when you aren't just chasing someone or when you're trying to get from point A or B, you got the cops and the mafia after you, and these guys are a real pain in the dick. Seriously, they do not leave you alone in this game. They are ruthless. Their pathfinding is actually pretty decent too. It was just really difficult sometimes to get them off your ass, and that's probably the biggest challenge of the game, is trying to get them off you or making the time limit. And this game can actually get pretty challenging, especially towards the end. You'll have to replay missions a couple times to really get a feel for them, or you'll just get lucky. But if you beat every mission in either your first or second attempt, this game is actually really short. Like, it's like the length of the movie. Seriously, you can beat it in like 2.5 hours. There's a sandbox mode here, and there's even a multiplayer mode, but I don't really have anything to comment on those. The game is fine enough. Maybe I'd like it a lot more if I had seen the movie. The movie came out like 30 years before the game, which was really odd, and again, releasing a PS1 game in 2002 was a ballsy move. Yeah, the game was fine enough. If you really like the movie, I guess maybe check it out. Otherwise, you could probably just skip it. Alright, and so here we have Grand Theft Auto 2, released by Rockstar in '99 and 2000. Now, when it comes to Grand Theft Auto 2, it really does look at the original game and just kind of has more of the same, but it does build a little on top of it. The game still has that open world and gives you the freedom. It does incentivize you to do violent acts of nature though, as the game is very point driven. You need points to progress through the game. You get points for killing people, stealing cars, selling cars, or blowing stuff up, and of course getting the police killed. And of course, doing these actions will alert the police, especially killing them will definitely alert the police and make them want to kill you, so you gotta try to stay alive and all that jazz. Then of course there's a bunch of the missions that you can do. You get jobs from various crime syndicates, and these are what you'd expect: kill people, drive somewhere really fast, run someone over, destroy stuff. And something introduced in GTA 2 is the idea of loyalty and respect. Doing missions for certain crime syndicates gets you more respect, meaning the gang will give you harder and tougher missions, and you'll become loyal with them. They'll trust you more, they'll respect you more. But on the flip side, other gangs will see that you're loyal to a certain gang and might even be hostile towards you because of that. And it can get to a point where you can actually be locked out of other gangs' missions because you're so loyal to a certain gang, which is a cool little aspect. The setting of GTA 2 is really weird. It's really different from the other games. The setting is a retro-futuristic metropolis, referred to only as Anywhere USA, and it's divided into 3 different districts that you'll go through as you progress through the game. The time period is like not even specified. It doesn't really make any sense. Like, sometimes I think it takes place around 1999, and sometimes I got no idea. I think it's in like the future. Very unique setting for the Grand Theft Auto series. But yeah, the core gameplay is very similar to the original GTA. If you like the original GTA, you'll love GTA 2, as it's kind of just more of the same. It is a bit improved. The radio stations are pretty good. The game looks a little better. The controls are better. But yeah, it's really the same kind of gameplay loop here. I still don't really know if I recommend this. I mean, if you want GTA on Dreamcast, you got it here, but there's also a Game Boy Color port, and we're not going to talk about that. Is it worth playing nowadays? Probably not. So here's a Rockstar game you'll actually probably recognize, Manhunt 2 by Rockstar London, primarily released in 2007. Now Manhunt 2, they really looked at what made Manhunt Manhunt. It was a lot of violence, a lot of gore, a lot of shocking, really messed up situations, and decided that they were going to double down on it. They were going to make Manhunt 2 maybe like the most violent game of all time. It was actually rated AO for a spell, and you know, I can definitely say Manhunt 2 is a very, very violent game. It's probably the most violent game on this list. However, violence doesn't equal quality, and I think that Manhunt 2 actually has a multitude of issues with it outside of its violence. Don't get me wrong, the violence is great, and to start off on a positive, the executions are fantastic. These are some of the most violent, gory executions I've ever seen in a video game. This is like one of the most violent games ever made. Not even close. It is out of control with its violence. But when it comes to the actual game, I think that there is a lot to be desired here. And I actually did like a full 20-minute review of this game a couple years ago, but I'll summarize some of the points I made there. The story has you playing as a new character, Danny, and he's actually locked up in an insane asylum. He also has amnesia and doesn't really remember anything. He's with his buddy Leo, and the two of them escape the asylum after a crazy thunderstorm, and they're just kind of trying to figure out what in the hell happened in Danny's past and try to get away from all this bad shit. The story, I think, is a huge downgrade from the first game, and I didn't actually like it very much. It starts off interesting enough, but the twists in this game, I think the twists just straight up suck. and I didn't think the story or the characters were very good. And then the atmosphere of this game just completely missed the first game. The first game had an amazing, scary atmosphere to it. This game, absolutely not. I think it just drops the ball completely with its atmosphere. When it comes to the actual gameplay, it plays decently similar to the original game. You are hiding in the shadows, taking out people quietly, and you can get into some fist fights or fights with weapons, and of course guns eventually. Now, when you're just hiding in the shadows, taking people out stealthily, and doing these gruesome executions, I think it is actually pretty decent. It really does actually kind of capture the magic of the first game. Unfortunately, Manhunt 2 is just bogged down with way too much BS that is not this. Whether it's the terrible hand-to-hand combat or the awful gunplay, the rest of Manhunt 2's gameplay is just not very good. Seriously, the hand-to-hand sucks in this game. Even when you have a weapon, it's just not very good. It's super clunky, and it's like the Warriors came out a couple years before this, and that game had way better hand-to-hand than this. This just isn't good. And then the gunplay, the less said about it, the better. Honestly, even GTA, like the older GTA games, have better gunplay than this, and the frame rate just tanks most of the time and kills whatever challenge and atmosphere you had going on with Manhunt 2. The game is also nowhere near as challenging or long as the first game. It took me maybe half the time it took me to finish the first game, and the controls are just as clunky. Really, it's just not worth playing Manhunt 2 nowadays. Look up the gory executions, get grossed out, and move on with your life. That's really all I gotta say about Manhunt 2. It's just not worth playing. And so here we have the very underrated Thrasher Presents Skate and Destroy, developed by Z-Axis and published by Rockstar Games for the PS1 in 1999. Skate and Destroy was very different from lots of games that came out, specifically a certain Birdman. And since we're already talking Tony Hawk, I'll just bring it up. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater came out slightly before Skate and Destroy. They were actually both being made at the same time, and you already know what ended up happening to this game. Barely anybody talks about this game at this point in time, and that is a real shame. It is very different from Pro Skater. Pro Skater is like the exact opposite of a skating game from Skate and Destroy. Pro Skater was a very arcade, crazy, point-driven experience. This game, while there is points, it is definitely along the lines of a simulator. This could be seen as like the OG Skate. Before Skate 1 came out, there was this game. You're not going to be doing a 900 off a jump. You're going to be doing a lot more realistic skating maneuvers, and your board has health, your character has health. You can actually seriously get hurt and break bones. It's, again, a lot more realistic than anything Tony Hawk was doing at the time. The button layouts are different. The physics are pretty, again, realistic and just different. The control layout is interesting. I'll leave it at that, but the game definitely does feel janky and rough around the edges nowadays. Of course, a simulator from the PS1 era isn't going to be the smoothest to come back to, so you gotta temper your expectations a little bit. But nowadays, yeah, it is pretty janky to play the game, but it is very commendable how this game was really committed to its simulator gameplay. Now you have a whole like kind of campaign mode to go through where you can freely explore areas and then do the 2-minute challenge, and yeah, it's not the longest thing in the world, but there's a number of characters to play as, all fictional, and you get to go through it as all of them, and it's fun enough. The game has a great soundtrack, a wonderful soundtrack that is full of great 90s hip-hop, and then the game also has some multiplayer. I've never tried the multiplayer, but it's probably fun. How many skating games really have bad multiplayer outside of Pro Skater 5? It's probably a fun time. Now, despite this game's clunkiness, despite how janky it is and how weird it is to come back to, I think the game is still pretty alright. I think it is very commendable for what it does. It really did start the whole skating simulator subgenre that is around nowadays that Skate really popularized. Like, it was this game that really did start it, and so, I mean, I'll give some props to that. A nice little clap here, and yeah, it's a fun game. I'm not going to recommend it over really any skate game, but if you want a really interesting skating game from the PS1, just a really interesting skating game in general, I think this might be worth trying. Everybody else, I mean, take it or leave it. So here is one of the more forgotten games on the list. Here is State of Emergency, developed by VIS Entertainment and published by Rockstar Games for the PS2 in 2002. State of Emergency was very different from what people were expecting Rockstar Games to follow up with after Grand Theft Auto 3. See, Grand Theft Auto 3 came out shortly before State of Emergency, and even though Rockstar didn't actually develop this game, people really thought this was the follow-up to GTA 3 and were very disappointed immediately. And if you couldn't tell, this game is nothing like GTA, like at all. It is a beat 'em up. It's like if they brought River City from the NES and put it on the PS2. It is just a straight up beat 'em up. It's very linear, very somewhat open environments, but not really. And there really is only one objective, and that's just to defeat everyone. Whether you're beating them up with your fists, or you find a weapon on the ground and you pummel them into the ground with it, or you just straight up find a gun and start gunning people down, that's the objective of State of Emergency. You're just kind of killing or smashing everyone's brains in. There's not a lot of depth here, there's not a lot of complexity, and the game doesn't really offer all that much. You're just kind of dropped into this environment and are told to just cause as much chaos as possible. The game is very point driven. I know that's something that's forgotten these days in gaming, but there's points here. You want to try to get as many points. There's even like a little mode where you can get like quests from people, but really it's all the same gameplay. You just go around beating up everybody or eventually finding a gun and killing them. I know I basically just said the same thing twice, but that's really all you do in this game. And the game has aged. And the beat 'em up gameplay, it's aged. It's not the best. Coming back all these years later, it's a bit difficult. The Warriors and Bully have much better beat 'em up gameplay than this game did. It's very clunky, the controls are kind of shoddy, it's really unrefined. And when you get a gun, usually it's just pretty terrible all around. I mean, the camera's just awful, and you're just kind of shooting into nothing, hoping that you spray and pray, essentially. It is kind of difficult to come back to in that sense, but if you can get a grip on the controls, I mean, what you have here is a decent enough time. The game isn't exactly very long. You can probably finish everything in a few hours, but it is pretty goofy, and just going around mindlessly destroying everything and causing chaos is always going to have its fun in a Rockstar game. Now, I'm not going to tell you to go seek the game out or anything, but if you see it for a couple bucks at like a garage sale or a flea market, maybe it's worth trying. I remember seeing this game in the bargain bin for like over a decade, so there's no way it's worth like anything. Interestingly enough, there actually was a sequel to this game, but it is not by Rockstar Games, and that's why it's not here and I don't have any experience with it, but State of Emergency, everybody. And so here we have like the strangest game on the list. We have Rockstar Games presents Table Tennis, mostly developed by Rockstar San Diego and released on the 360 in 2006 and a port to the Wii in 2007. I remember playing this on the Wii way back in the day, and I really still don't understand why Rockstar Games made a table tennis game. I'm pretty sure this game was made to just kind of test the Xbox 360 with Rockstar Games and their engine, but looking back, I'm just like, why? Why would they test it with a table tennis game and not, I don't know, like any of their other properties? Well, regardless of that, what we have here is a very serious, realistic, simple, but difficult to master table tennis game. As someone who thinks table tennis is like kind of fun, especially with friends and just kind of casually playing it, there's some enjoyment to be had here. This is without a doubt the best table tennis game I've ever played. It's certainly way better than Wii Plays Table Tennis, and it has a lot more going on. It's very realistic. There's a bunch of different moves you can actually execute, and it can get, again, very serious with really long rallies. I remember on the Wii there was a couple different control schemes, and I remember it being pretty decent for the most part, but if you're going to play it nowadays, you're really going to want to play the Xbox version. It even works on Series X, and it's table tennis. If you're going to play a table tennis game and not just, I don't know, real table tennis, you're going to be playing this game. This game kind of blew people's minds back when it came out, and it's still a very solid table tennis game. It's still a very solid sports game, but when you compare it to all the other games on this list, there's a reason it's not all that high. But it is a good game. It is a good sports game. Very rare nowadays, I know, but good game nonetheless, and we like those. So here we have Smuggler's Run 2 Hostile Territories, released by Angel Studios in 2001 for the PS2 and 2002 for the GameCube as Smuggler's Run Warzones. Now, while the original Smuggler's Run felt very similar to Midnight Club Street Racing, Smuggler's Run 2 feels very similar to Midnight Club 2. The handling is a hell of a lot better than the original games, and the physics are all around just much more refined and better and less unpredictable. Now, they actually address some of the issues I had with the first game. First off, the environments are way better than the first games. They're a lot less drab and flat. There's a lot of verticality here. There's a lot going on. You'll go through valleys, you'll go up mountains, you'll go down mountains. It actually reminds me a lot of the game Fuel, if you remember that from Codemasters. I really loved Fuel, and I don't know, I just got Fuel vibes from this, and it was actually pretty decently done, the environment. And when it comes to what you're doing in the game, it is pretty similar to the first game. You're doing races, you're going checkpoint to checkpoint, you're doing the smuggler runs, and of course you're trying to get away from the police. The police are not as bad as they were in the first game, where they just wreck your shit in like a second and you gotta just completely start over. Oh, there's still a lot of trial and error here. It's still pretty egregious by today's standards, but it's nowhere near as bad as the first. The first game was just sometimes unbearable with how bad the police were. But yeah, I like the variety, I like the environments, I think the cars handle pretty alright for the most part, and I think that this is actually a decent game. It's a decent improvement on the first game also. Would I recommend it above any of the Midnight Club games? Yeah, no, I would not. I would say go play any of the other Midnight Club games. But again, fun, decent little game. I can recommend it if you like driving games, and what you get here, yeah, it's a pretty decent time. So here we have the original Midnight Club Street Racing, released in 2000. It was a PS2 launch title developed by Angel Studios, who would go on to become Rockstar San Diego. And while I think the original Midnight Club is fun, it hasn't aged all that gracefully. Plot, if you can even call it that, was as basic as it gets. It's just about a bunch of urban street racers known as the Midnight Club who race for pride, power, and glory. The main gameplay loop is actually incredibly basic. You really just drive around this kind of open area and look for other people to race. They're marked on your map, you drive up to them, you flash your lights or honk, and then, yeah, you just end up racing them, and that's the whole game. It's just a series of races. Sometimes you race one person at a time, sometimes you race 5 people at a time. There's really not all that much to it. You just race, and you get new cars as you race, and eventually you go through a couple different locations, and you do the same thing at all those locations. You just race. The driving in this game is alright. I mean, it gets totally blown away by the other Midnight Club games, but this is serviceable. It's fine enough. The physics, I will say, are kind of wonky. It can feel a bit clunky sometimes when you're doing like big turns, and the physics overall can be just kind of questionable. And then on the topic of questionable, we have the AI, which has plenty of rubber banding and can also be kind of questionable, where it just magically catches up to you at the very end. But the driving seemed fine enough. The presentation was alright. Also, everything looked decent enough. The music, sadly, is just totally forgettable. I couldn't even tell you any of the music in this game. And I thought the frame rate was also kind of suspicious. It did drop sometimes when things were getting a little crazy. And yeah, Midnight Club 1 is pretty alright. It's pretty short. I beat it in one night, maybe like 4 or so hours. And I mean, it was the one that started the series, but nowadays I can't really recommend anybody come back to it. I mean, you can get it dirt cheap, but you might as well just play the other Midnight Club games. And here's another game that's different from the rest. Here we have Oni, developed by Bungie, actually, of Halo fame, and published by Rockstar Games in 2001 for PS2 and Windows. Now, Oni came out just before Halo 1, so Bungie was not a household name yet. They were still, relatively unknown. They had some good games under their belt, but they weren't, superstardom level where they are now with, say, Destiny or some of the later Halo games. Oni is a very different type of game. It is a focused, single-player, third-person action game with a lot of anime aesthetics and an anime kind of setting in general. It's very similar to Ghost in the Shell. It reminds me a lot of Ghost in the Shell, and I feel like that's what they were kind of going for. The game's plot is pretty generic, though. It's a plot to stop an evil organization, and that's really all it amounts to. There's not all that much to it. At least the main character looks pretty cool. The game is a brawler-shooter hybrid. It feels a bit like a beat-em-up, but in like 3D. Combos are very fluid, and they look and feel really good. Like, even nowadays, I'm like, wow, the animation is actually superb in this game. And yeah, beating fools up, it actually is decently fun. But it wouldn't be a Bungie game without guns. Now, you do get guns in this game, and the shooting, it's actually really awkward. It's really clunky, and honestly, it's just kind of questionable. I didn't find the shooting to be all that good in this game. When you're just in hand-to-hand combat fighting one, maybe 2 enemies at a time, I think it is actually pretty solid. The combos are good. There is a lot of useless ones, but everything flows really well, and like I said, the animation is pretty good. Enemies can absolutely kick your ass. Sometimes the enemies just wipe the floor with you and your character takes forever to get up or react. I really wish there was a block button in this game because the combat can actually get pretty frustrating, especially when there's more than one enemy that you're fighting in hand-to-hand. But once you get pretty into the hand-to-hand combat, you learn some of the combos and it's, again, one enemy. It can actually be a pretty good time here. It is very interesting. The levels are all really basic. For the most part, it's just go from point A to B, occasionally interacting with the environment and just fighting pretty much everything along the way. However, some of the levels really just kind of go on and on. They really drag, and some of them are really just bland and uninteresting. Like, there's just not a lot going on here with some of these levels. But for every level that's not that good, there's usually like 2 or 3 that are pretty decent. The lack of music for the most part doesn't help things either. Like Halo, music only plays at important parts in the level rather than the whole level, just kind of adding to that bland, almost boring feeling. I remember playing this a long time ago and thinking it wasn't very good, the controls were awkward and the levels were boring, but coming back to play it nowadays, I think it is pretty alright and I can appreciate it for what it is. I know the game has a decent fan community and there's a lot of patches to get it working on modern computers, and if what you see here interests you, I think you ought to try it out. It is very different from not only every game on this list, but what Bungie has made. It's a very interesting game, but it was a little ahead of its time. Again, the combos and the animations are pretty good. The game is clunky by today's standards, but I think it is worth trying to some extent. Alright, and so here we got Midnight Club 2 by Rockstar San Diego. Now, Midnight Club 2 is actually a pretty big improvement on the first game in a number of different aspects. The plot exactly the same as the first game, where you're just racing a bunch of elite racers around a couple cities, this being LA, Paris, and Tokyo, but it does have some fun characters thrown in there, and the voice acting is pretty cheesy and pretty silly for the time. But the general gameplay has been refined by quite a bit. Yes, the main gameplay hook is you drive around an open area, honk or flash your lights at people and race them, but it has been improved in a number of different ways. First off, the worlds, the open worlds that you actually drive around in, are much better than the first game. The first game had very flat, boring maps. This game, not like that at all. These maps have a ton of detail, there's a bunch of shortcuts, alleyways, slopes, declines, and there's just a lot more to these maps that make the racing a lot more interesting. There's also more than just like one racing type. There's a bunch of different racing types to make different types of events. Sometimes all the checkpoints you have to race to are not in order, so you have to drive around the map and try to figure out what the fastest route is, and that can lead to some crazy experimentation. The cars control great. The controls are just great in general. The cars feel a lot better. They're super light. They can turn on a dime, and it really fits the Midnight Club aesthetic. It is super arcadey. I mean, you can even control the cars in midair, and it introduced a few of the Midnight Club techniques that would become a staple of the series. The game also introduced bikes, and there is hang time. I never really use these bikes because I just crash my car too damn much. You're going so fast in this game. And speaking of going fast, by the end of this game you are going blistering fast, and this game actually gets really freaking difficult. Like, I was kinda shocked with how difficult Midnight Club 2 gets. I was like, holy shit, I've been on this race for like 45 minutes. This is hella hard. I'm not this awful at the game. Like, the AI are stupid good. There's tons of cars in the way. The vans, the minivans, they always get in your fucking way, and you just hate the minivans. No, Midnight Club 2 is not messing around. It is actually a very difficult game. One thing that wasn't totally improved from the first game is the customization. I think it's pretty lacking and very basic in Midnight Club 2. It's like you can change the color. Cool. I will say the music, though, the music is pretty great in Midnight Club 2. I would say it's a solid improvement from Midnight Club 1. That's really all I can say about Midnight Club 2 in general, is just it's a very nice improvement on the first game, and I can actually recommend it. And so here we have Red Dead Revolver, the first of the now very popular Red Dead series, developed primarily by Rockstar San Diego, and it was released in 2004. Red Dead Revolver is a very different type of game from pretty much all of Rockstar Games' games, especially the Red Dead Redemption games. It is very different. It is almost nothing like it, actually. The only thing that this game really has in common with the Redemption games is the setting and everything that brings, and I guess the Deadeye mechanic. This game does not try to be a cinematic open world masterpiece. It is just not like that at all. It is a very arcade oriented linear shooter where it really feels like a shooting gallery. Everything from the controls, the levels, the weapons, it's all very arcade. The game is incredibly level oriented and you move through very linear levels. You get dropped into these levels and your goal is basically the same for almost every level. You want to shoot and kill everything that moves. You get a variety of weapons in the game. You get to actually choose your loadout for most of the levels. You don't have regenerating health, and yeah, you're just blasting everybody. The story of the game takes place in the 1880s, and it follows bounty hunter Red Harlow in his quest for revenge after the murder of his parents when he was just a child. You play as a couple other characters throughout the story, but it really is all about Red, and the story can sometimes feel a bit segmented, but it all comes together pretty nicely, actually. Now, since you're shooting people most of the game, how is the shooting in this game? Well, the shooting can take some time to get used to. It does feel a little clunky, it doesn't feel as smooth as you'd like it, but again, you can actually get pretty used to it. At least the gunplay is relatively satisfying. A lot of the weapons have a good kick to them, and it is satisfying to just totally blow someone's brains out with like a revolver. I do wish the weapons felt a little more different from each other though. This game also has Deadeye, where everything goes into slow-mo and you can target certain body parts and then just totally blow someone away, which it was cool then and it's still cool now. The game also has duels where you gotta draw and shoot faster than your opponent, and these start out fine enough, but they actually get really challenging, especially towards the end of the game, and they can get a bit annoying, and I wasn't huge on them, they were just okay. But all in all, Red Dead Revolver is actually a really fun time. It is a very solid game, and it has a ton of personality and charm to it, whether with the quirky characters, crazy boss fights, or really just engaging levels. I actually do think it is worth playing. The presentation is pretty crusty, especially on the PS2, what I was playing it on, and it can be sometimes hard to see. It's so blurry. Especially the sunset levels where it looks like they're pouring Vaseline all over the screen. The frame rate can get pretty choppy when a bunch of action is going on as well. The game is readily available on PS4, so if you want to play it on a modern system, there's that, and I think it is a really fun arcade time. Okay, so here's the fan favorite LA Noire. Primarily developed by Team Bondi, however Rockstar Games did come in to assist, especially towards the end of the development of the game. Now, despite it being at the bottom of this list, I would still say LA Noire is a pretty good game, and I did enjoy my time with it. Rockstar didn't put out a bad game in the 2010s. They really just didn't. I remember when LA Noire came out back in 2011, and I just had absolutely no interest in it. I was like, this is nothing like GTA. Why did Rockstar put this out? It wasn't until I got older, more mature, and really realized what this game was about, and learned about its tumultuous development cycle, and yeah, I actually went back and played it, and it's pretty good. The story is about Cole Phelps as he moves up the ranks from a cop to a full-blown detective in one of the most crime-ridden cities in the world, LA, during one of its worst times. The story, I think for the most part, is pretty good, but it does have some glaring issues, particularly with the pacing. The pacing of this game, I feel, is just kind of terrible. This initial setup and the first couple hours are not very exciting at all. In fact, I would say the story really doesn't get exciting until the last, 3 or 4 hours. I mean, Cole really doesn't have a lot going on and nothing feels personal to him. It's in the last couple hours that the story really shines and actually gets really good. It's just a shame it takes way too long, way too long to get good or even decent. And with that in mind, I could see why some people would drop the game before the story gets interesting. The gameplay is a mix of detective work and some GTA-esque gameplay. It takes place in a fake open world similar to Mafia 2, where there's not really an open world to explore. There's nothing to see. It's just kind of there as a backdrop, which I like. It's a good change of pace. Most of the game is detective work, which can be fun. It really is like an adventure game where you're investigating crime scenes, clues, questioning people, getting into some interrogations, and yeah, I actually really do like it. There is some more GTA-esque gameplay, like I mentioned, where you get into shootouts, you have to chase people down, you do some driving here and there, and this is fine too. It's pretty mindless for the most part. It's not challenging, and the game will actually let you skip these action set pieces and get back to the detective work. Something about LA Noire that was really heralded was the graphics. When the game was released, the graphics were considered very landmark and amazing, especially with the faces, how people's faces were mocapped in, and you could see their emotions and see if they were lying or how they were reacting to stuff. And I'll just be real, the graphics have not aged very well at all. They're very uncanny when it comes to the faces. It's honestly really hard to read people. I just kind of had to look it up to see what some of the tricks are, but I didn't really care much for the graphics. At least the game is very well written. Most of these cases are really interesting and well done. Unfortunately, I can't say the same about the side cases. These just aren't very good. Now, the reason this game isn't so high on the list, it gets incredibly formulaic and just repetitive, and to be honest, almost everyone I know who has played this game dropped it at some point, and I can understand why. The pacing, like I mentioned earlier, it isn't very good. The game is a slow start, and all of the cases start out exactly the same, and so it gives you this real repetitive feeling where it's just the same thing over and over and over. And this isn't a short game. The game is well over 25 hours long, and it can feel like a slog at times because of how similar everything feels. Once you get to the end, I promise you the end, the last couple cases, they are really different, they're really good, but you shouldn't have to put this much time into it to get really invested, and I could totally see why somebody would, again, drop it. I still do recommend the game. It is different, but it's definitely not for everybody, and you will need some patience with this one. Still a good time. Alright, and so here we have GTA Chinatown Wars, released in 2009, developed primarily by Rockstar Lead. The game was originally released for the DS, but it would release for the PSP and the iPhone later. With the game being made primarily with the DS in mind, it does have some key differences between the other Grand Theft Auto games. It's much more like the first two GTA games, where it is from a top-down perspective, but it has a lot of the modern elements from later GTA games. The game has a totally unique presentation as it is cel shaded and looks much more like a comic book, a first and only time the series has done this. However, the PSP version does not have this. I remember playing this game many years ago on my DS, on my R4, and then eventually picking it up on my iPhone when I was younger as well. And I remember being decently impressed with it. The game does utilize some of the DS's gimmicky elements such as the touchscreen and blowing into the mic, but for the most part you've got a real full-scale Grand Theft Auto game here. It's just top-down. It takes place in GTA 4's Liberty City, but it's obviously a lot more scaled back and smaller, and of course some compromises are going to be made here to the map and the world and the gameplay since it's on the DS, but again, I think that this is actually a pretty decent to good attempt at a Grand Theft Auto game on like the DS. The story is actually pretty unique too. You play as Huang Li, he's a Triad member, and you actually do a lot of drug selling in this game. And it goes over his struggles, especially with being in the Triad. I think it's actually pretty unique, especially for the GTA series, and it's honestly become kinda underrated. But yeah, when it comes to the gameplay, what you've got here is a typical GTA game. You've got a fully explorable open world where you take on missions and you can sell drugs. A lot of the missions are your standard GTA affair, and yeah, while it is from a top-down perspective, so it doesn't, control as nice or as engaging as, say, some of the other games, it's still actually pretty good. And I think the whole drug dealing aspect of the game is unique for the series, and it throws in a little wrinkle in there for the gameplay. I think that this is actually a pretty good game. It turns out that this is actually the highest rated DS game of all time, interestingly enough, and well, I don't know about that. I think that it is still actually good, and it is worth playing. I don't really love the top-down GTA games, but if you're going to play any of the top-down GTA games, this is the only one that I think is really worth playing nowadays. Okay, so here we got GTA Liberty City Stories, initially released for the PSP in 2005, but then put on the PS2 a year later. Now, Liberty City Stories was a big deal for the time as it was the first 3D GTA title to be released for handheld devices. All we had before was GTA Advance and the ports of GTA 1 and 2 on Game Boy. The game is a prequel to Grand Theft Auto 3 using the same setting, that being Liberty City. It takes place in 1998 and follows mobster Tony Cipriani, a character who is in GTA 3. And it's about Tony rising to power and becoming the mob boss that he is in GTA 3. The story is pretty decent in this game. I'm not going to act like it's amazing or these characters are all that memorable or it isn't, predictable, but it is actually pretty alright. Now when it comes to the gameplay, it really does play like the GTA games from the mid-2000s. It feels the most probably like Grand Theft Auto 3 since, it is the same city. And if you like the gameplay of the Grand Theft Auto games from the mid-2000s, as most people do, then yeah, you'll like the gameplay here. It does feel a little scaled back from, say, San Andreas, which this game came out after, such as you cannot swim at all. You'll just die if you fall in the water. But the game does have some indoor environments. GTA 3 did not have that, really. But when it comes to the missions, it definitely does feel a bit scaled back from San Andreas. Again, it was made for the PSP, and most of the missions are your standard GTA crime affair. There's nothing really here that stood out all that much to me. Most of them are pretty fine to good. There wasn't really any horrible ones, at least. When it comes to the controls, they feel just as good as the other PS2 GTA games. I've only ever played this game on PS2, so I only know that version. It feels fine, the cars control nice, and the shooting is pretty decent. Sadly, despite being pretty decent to good, I would say that Liberty City Stories is a bit unmemorable. It just doesn't have a ton going for it, and there's a reason most people don't even really talk about it nowadays. I mean, at least the radio stations were decent. It also doesn't have length on its side. It's maybe like 6 or 7 hours. If you explore everything, maybe you can add a couple more hours at most, but yeah, it's not that big either. Is it worth playing nowadays? Yeah, it's pretty alright still. Alright, so here we got GTA Vice City Stories released for the PSP in 06 and the PS2 in 07. Vice City Stories would be the last of the original GTA 3D series. After this we would get GTA 4, which changed to a much more realistic style. And like Liberty City Stories, this is a prequel, this time to Vice City Stories, and you follow Vance, a minor character in the original game. His brother, though, Lance, would be a much more integral character to Vice City. The story here is actually pretty decent. It's about the brothers conflicting with rival gangs, drug lords, and really just trying to, rise up in the criminal world. I think this game is able to capture Vice City's vibes really well. I love Vice City's vibes and characters, and I think that this game really does build off of that. It's not as good as Vice City, obviously, when it comes to the characters, world, story, and all that, but it still is pretty decent, and they actually do have something here. and I liked it. This game is much more in line with San Andreas in terms of improvements, like you can swim, you can fly airplanes, you can really interact with every type of vehicle that you could in San Andreas. And you know, when it comes to the controls, at least on the PS2 version, this might be the best of all the GTA PS2 games. It actually does feel pretty nice, it is smooth for the most part, and the combat does not feel anywhere near as clunky. I'm specifically referring to the hand-to-hand combat, which has been, quote, overhauled, as the developer said, and it does actually feel pretty alright. And then the game has absolutely what you expect. You can free roam around a pretty decently sized Vice City that does feel different from the original Vice City. You can do the main missions, or you can buy properties and expand your businesses like how Vice City did. I like the whole business thing to GTA. I've always thought that this is pretty neat. It is a bit expanded on here, and some of the side missions are actually pretty decent here. It's not all just throwaway filler. I like the whole beach patrol thing and where you would have to deal with these bikers on the beach, which was pretty funny. But in general, the side missions were actually pretty decent. The game is a bit longer than Liberty City Stories, and I thought that the campaign was just a bit more fulfilling. There's actually some memorable missions here in the main campaign, like the one with Phil Collins. I think everything to do with Phil Collins was actually pretty great here. I did like the campaign for the most part. I think that this is a pretty solid GTA game. When comparing all the GTA games, yeah, it is a little lower on the list, but it still is a pretty good game for the most part, and you should probably try it out if you like GTA. And so here we have Red Dead Redemption Undead Nightmare, the standalone expansion pack to Red Dead Redemption. And this expansion's interesting. It's set in an alternate timeline from the original Red Dead Redemption. Follows returning protagonist John Marston, a former outlaw who sets out to find the cause and possible cure to a zombie plague that has infected his wife and son. Marston will go and liberate towns overrun by zombies and try to help out people along the way. Undead Nightmare is absolutely one of the very best DLCs, expansions, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't get really much better than Undead Nightmare. It takes all the great things from Red Dead Redemption and puts it in a completely different setting with a new twist on it. Having zombies is a pretty great addition, and it's kind of crazy that Rockstar Games had never made a zombie game up until now. The story is a lot more lighthearted than the original game. It's certainly a lot campier, and it definitely pays tribute to all those B-movie zombie flicks, which is clearly what they were going for. And this game has a great sense of humor. I remember just absolutely busting up the first time I played through this game.
You eat babies. You have to survive. Everyone knows that. Ain't your fault.
We eat berries and mushrooms, you fool.
You eat babies.
Now when it comes to the gameplay, it is pretty much just Red Dead Redemption. I mean, this is a standalone expansion for it. I would expect it to be pretty similar. It is that open world gameplay you know and love, where you can explore to your heart's content, do some main missions, or go off and do side missions. There's hunts, there's mystical creatures to find, and of course fending off lots and lots of zombies. A lot of the mission types return from the original game, only now they've got a nice zombie twist on it. For example, in the original game you would hunt fugitives. Here, you're trying to rescue family members from zombies, but it's basically the same kind of objective. There is some variance when it comes to the zombies. You're not just fighting the same type of zombie. Sure, these are all pretty generic when it comes to the zombie genre, but it's nice that you're killing more than one type. John himself has new weapons as well. He gets zombie bait, he actually gets holy water, and then gets a blunderbuss of all things, and you can use zombie parts as ammunition. Isn't that cool? John can even ride undead horses. He summons them with a whistle. He can summon them like Geralt with Roach from Witcher 3, only this was like way before. You can even find the 4 horses of the apocalypse, which is pretty cool. The game's campaign is actually a pretty decent length. It's not over and done with really quick, especially if you do the side content. You can actually get quite a bit out of this. They even added some new multiplayer stuff to it as well. There was 2 new multiplayer modes, and there was of course a bunch of cosmetic crap. I only played a little bit of this back in the day, but I remember it was fun. Undead Nightmare would be Rockstar's last single-player expansion, which really is a shame because I think this is a great game and it's totally worth playing, especially if you love Red Dead.
Warriors, come out to play. Warriors.
And so like he implied, here's The Warriors, released in 2005 for the PS2 and the Xbox, developed mostly by Rockstar Toronto. And if you couldn't tell, this heavily plays off the 1979 film of the same name, which I went and saw the movie before I played the game. And you know, the movie, the great soundtrack, it is pretty much all the music from the movie, but it adds a bunch as well, and it's all superb. The atmosphere this game has is really well done. I really did like the atmosphere of The Warriors. And the game is easily one of the very best movie games ever made. It really pays a lot to the movie. It adds a lot to the movie. Again, it adds a bunch of lore and backstory and just characters. And I really did appreciate it. And maybe it was because I watched the movie first and then played the game, but I thought this game kicked ass. Now, in my Rockstar Games from the 2000s ranking, I had this game quite a bit lower, and after some reflecting, I really think that this game should be quite a bit higher. I thought it was actually pretty memorable. It's rough around the edges, it's got some issues, it's not amazing by today's standards, or even back then it wasn't amazing, but it still is a really damn fun good time. And it's totally worth playing. It even had a decent PSP port, but again, totally worth playing, and the movie's totally worth watching too. And so here we have Max Payne 2 by Remedy Entertainment. Payne 2 is a pretty good shooter with a great story. However, when it comes to all three of those Max Payne games, I do think it is the weakest of the three. The story is about Max, still a hard-boiled cop, going up against a group known as the Cleaners, and some other shit goes down that I won't say. A lot of the game also focuses around Max's new love interest, Mona Sachs, who is also a very strong character for the series. You even get to actually play as her in a few segments. However, I thought those were the weakest segments of the game. Max Payne 2 retains a lot of the great gameplay that made the first game so great in the first place. You go around shooting basically everything that moves, you have a ton of different weapons to kill all these bad guys with, you get to go into slow-mo and do some really cool looking Matrix style kills, and you go through some interesting set pieces. Now, while you got to do some really cool looking stuff in the original Max Payne, the second game just lets you go absolutely apeshit, as you can just be in slow-mo a ton of time. You can jump, run, spin, roll, you can do a bunch of stuff in slow-mo and be in it way longer. It lets you just go completely apeshit. And you look really cool doing it. I mean, this game makes you feel like a badass. That much is inevitable. However, the thing that keeps it from ranking any higher on this list, and the reason it's my least favorite Max Payne, is because it's actually the shortest Max Payne of them all. The game was maybe like 4 hours long, and I just wish it was longer so I could get more invested into the game. I mean, I had such a fun time playing the game. When it ended, I was like, wait, that's it? It's over already? I think the game could have easily gone on another hour or two and it wouldn't have dragged at all, but that's just me, and kind of like American Nightmare again, the game does reuse environments a few times. I mean, there's 1 or 2 environments you go to more than once, and I'm just like, the game isn't already that long, like, come on now. Still, if you're looking for an older, great action game that is on the shorter side, you can beat it in like a sitting or two, you can't go wrong with Max Payne 2, because it's a very good time. Alright, so here I got a double whammy for you. I got both the GTA 4 expansions here, both of them released in 2009 for the 360, and we have The Lost and the Damned and the Ballad of Gay Tony. Originally, I did have these two as separate entries, but no matter how I did this list, these two entries were always right next to each other, so I thought, might as well just put them together. Now, both these expansions are very similar in a number of different ways. Both of them take place in Liberty City. It uses the same map as GTA 4. Both of them take place during GTA 4, and both of them involve characters that were just side characters in GTA 4, but are obviously the protagonists for their own stories. And both expansions use GTA 4's gameplay, so that really heavy kind of underwater feeling that you get while driving around is very present here that I'm not a big fan of, and the shooting does feel very weighted and is very cover oriented, but it's still pretty good. Despite all those similarities, the stories are actually very different from each other. The Lost and the Damned is about Johnny Klebitz, who is the vice president of the Liberty City chapter of the Lost MC, a motorcycle club, and it's about Johnny's efforts to keep the chapter running while dealing with tons of internal conflicts, gang warfare, drug running, and all sorts of wonderful things. The Ballad of Gay Tony, it follows Luis Fernando Lopez, a former drug dealer turned bodyguard and best friend of Anthony Gay Tony Prince, a nightclub owner and high-status socialite in Liberty City. And the story really is about them staying afloat and keeping the club running. Both stories are actually pretty great. They both use GTA 4's excellent storytelling, and I think they both tell really good stories, and they have some of the strongest characters and writing that the series has ever seen. They also do shed some light on some of the other aspects of GTA 4's missions. Now, when it comes to which expansion I like more, I definitely like the Ballad of Gay Tony more. I like its story and characters more. I think Lost and the Damned has a pretty good story, and it does have some good missions to it. I just think Ballad of Gay Tony has better missions, better characters, better writing, and I just found it a little bit more enjoyable. But that doesn't discount The Lost and the Damned at all. I think both of them are some of the best expansions or DLCs made for any game. Like, they're both great. They're both at least 4 or 5 hours long. They, again, have a pretty good story. They have some pretty good characters, and the gameplay is pretty good still. Both of these expansions added a ton of vehicles and weapons and modes to the multiplayer, so they really did add more to GTA 4. They didn't just reuse all of GTA 4's stuff. Really, every expansion or DLC should strive to be as good as these GTA 4 expansions because they're just really good expansions. Like, if every expansion or DLC was this good, we'd be in a lot better world. World hunger would probably be solved. Or maybe I would have gotten my Tree 50 from the Loch Ness Monster. Either way, it's totally worth playing. If you like GTA, totally play these. If you like open worlds, play them. They're some of the best expansions ever. It's pretty hard to like get this without GTA 4 at this point, so like just buy it all together. It's totally worth it. And so here we have the game that really brought GTA into the limelight, that just kind of made it explode with popularity. Grand Theft Auto 3, released in 2001. Now, you don't need me to tell you how GTA 3 really revolutionized gaming, especially in the 2000s, and how it really just changed the game. It wasn't the first open world game by any stretch of the imagination, but it really popularized and pioneered the genre. Now, has the game aged? Of course the game has aged. It hasn't aged all that remarkably, but what you still have here is a more than fine enough playable experience in modern day. It still has everything that you're looking for in a GTA game, just on a smaller scale compared to some of the later titles. You've still got a sprawling open world with a ton of collectibles, side missions, and then you have all of the main missions, the storyline of GTA 3. The story follows Claude, a silent protagonist who is betrayed and left for dead by his girlfriend when they're robbing a place. And it really leads him on a quest for revenge that leads him to become entangled in a world of crime, drugs, gang warfare, and just straight up corruption. The story is actually pretty good in this game, especially compared to GTA 1 and 2. It's a lot more fleshed out. There's really like characters here with personalities. Are they over the top? Of course they're over the top, but they're still pretty solid. The writing is decent enough. Yeah, it is a bit more basic than the other GTA games, and your main character doesn't really have a personality, but I still think it is pretty good. Now, the biggest change that GTA 3 has over its predecessors is that it's a fully explorable 3D world. It's now in a third-person perspective rather than the top-down flat perspective, and everything is, again, in a third-person view. The progression has changed completely as well. The whole point system from 1 and 2 are just gone. Now you can explore to your heart's content. There's a bunch to see, a bunch to do, and you can just do the main missions whenever you want. There's no lives either. But these missions are just done so much better. They're much more engrossing. They have interesting points to them. They've actually got some real challenge to them, especially towards the end of the game. They're going to kick your ass. And I found most of them genuinely fun. Sure, there are some stinkers here, and in fact, there's actually a lot of stinkers here all these years later. But so many of these missions are just so memorable, like the car bomb mission. I love this mission, and the amount of different ways you can do it, it's pretty great actually. Now, it's not all peaches and rosy here. This game has aged in a number of ways that make it difficult to come back to. The controls could definitely use some work. They take some time to get used to. They're very stiff, clunky, and shooting feels kind of terrible for the most part. Hand to hand is pretty awful, but at least the driving is actually pretty solid. It still feels really nice and it is smooth. The driving is very arcade. It doesn't go for a realistic vibe here, and I actually still think it holds up really well. Most of the game you are driving, so that's good at least. You also can't swim, which is really annoying, especially for any missions on a boat. But yeah, don't be surprised if you have a number of deaths because you're fighting the awkward controls. Speaking of death, this game is not messing around. They have no problem kicking your ass. This game actually is pretty challenging, and if you don't use cheats, you're going to be on some of these missions a long time. But despite that, you have an absolutely legendary game here with a great open world, a nice storyline, some fun missions, and you can just have a great time playing GTA 3. Whether it's 2001 or it's 2021, you're going to have a good time. And it's totally worth checking out the original version, I might add, not that shitty re-release from last year. And so here we got Midnight Club Los Angeles, the latest in the Midnight Club series, and this game came out in an interesting time in Rockstar's history. They were really shifting away from that cartoony arcade feel and were going for something a lot more detail-oriented, realistic, and sometimes almost simulation-based that Grand Theft Auto 4 really started, and Midnight Club LA, as a result, feels a lot more rooted than any of the other Midnight Club games, but it still is pretty crazy at times. It does still have all the Midnight Club staples though. You drive around an open world, this time being exclusively LA, challenging people to races. You start in this beater piece of shit car basically, and eventually upgrade your way up to nicer, cooler, better, faster cars with a ton of abilities like slowing time down, boosting, and even more. The story is actually different from the other Midnight Club games, particularly because there really is a story here. You play as an unnamed character who came from the Midwest. He comes to LA to be the best in the game, and he's just trying to race everyone and be better than everyone. There's a bunch of eccentric characters here to try to stop him or be friends with them, and yeah, he just races like everybody. And a lot of these characters, they're pretty goofy. They got some silly voice acting, and the writing can be a bit cringeworthy at times, but you know, I like the game's cheesy attitude. I won't lie though, a lot of times I did roll my eyes, especially at the main character, where I was just like, come on dude, really? Like, why even talking? I just would rather have nobody talk sometimes. Now, because this game is just LA and not a couple cities, Rockstar was really able to focus in on the detail and how realistic they wanted it to be to LA. And I gotta say, as someone who's been to LA a couple dozen times, this is very realistic to LA. I mean, aside from the traffic, you'd never move this fast in LA, no matter where you are or what time of the day it is, you will never move this fast. But in terms of how the locations are, yes, it is very close to LA, it's very detailed, and I can appreciate that. To be honest though, I would prefer multiple cities rather than one really detailed LA, but this is coming from someone who lives in California also, so take that with a grain of salt. This game is also the only Midnight Club game that lets you drive during daytime, which seems really counterintuitive to what Midnight Club is called. Seems pretty silly, but oh well. This game also has a lot, and I mean a lot more content than the other Midnight Club games. You do a lot more than just regular racing in the big open world here. There are tons of wager races you can make. You can actually do pink slip races. There's a lot of time trials. There's a bunch of different events here that are more than just driving up to somebody's car and honking at them and racing. It's actually pretty cool. And because of all this game is a lot longer than the other Midnight Club games. Like, it took me like almost 30 hours to beat. I didn't do like every mission either. I did most of them, but that is way longer than the other Midnight Club games. And just because it's way longer doesn't actually mean it's all that much better. I will be the first to say that the pacing in this game is not all that great. You are in the junker cars for way too long that feel very sluggish, and the beginning couple hours of the game, if not like beginning almost 10 hours of the game, do not feel anywhere near as fun as the other Midnight Club games. It's only the last like 5 to 10 hours where the game gets really fast, really crazy, doesn't feel sluggish, and just feels more like the old Midnight Clubs. Also, this game can feel very repetitive with how long it is and the fact that it's only the one map. Now, when everything clicks, when everything comes together, when you start going really fast, when you get a really fast car or a really fast bike, and by the way, the bikes rule in this game, way better than 2 and 3, and you know the map like the back of your hand, and you start getting to the fun, crazy events, this game really comes together, and it might be the most fun I've had with any of the Midnight Club games. Like, it really is that great when you're racing super fast towards the end of the game. It's a shame you have to go through so many hours of just kind of tedium and repetitiveness to get here, but where this is at the very end of the game, it's awesome. And the last thing I want to say is that the music is fantastic in this game, maybe the best in the whole series, and the customization and just car selection, superb, great, maybe some of the best, if not the best, car customization I've seen in gaming outside of Forza Horizon. Despite my shortcomings with Midnight Club LA, it is a fantastic game that should not be missed if you love driving games, and it can be played on modern Xboxes. It's a shame that this is the last Midnight Club game, seemingly forever at this point, but yeah, totally worth playing. And so here's the often forgotten Max Payne 3, released in 2012, and this was actually developed by Rockstar Games and not Remedy Entertainment, and that brought some differences. For starters, the story is a lot more in-depth. There's a lot of cutscenes in this game, a lot of voice acting. The comic book style of the original game is gone. The game is a lot longer, and the game actually featured multiplayer that was played pretty regularly, at least when it came out. The gameplay, though, was pretty much what you've come to expect from Max Payne, but with some modern touches. You could obviously take cover, but a lot of the game was still running around in bullet time trying to kill everyone, and just trying not to be gunned down yourself, taking lots of painkillers, tons of weapons that you're just destroying these dudes with, and the occasional set piece that makes for a really engaging time. Max Payne 3 really has two parts to it. It has the part where Max is dealing with his past, so a big part of the game does take place in the past, and that was always a big part of Max Payne, was him dealing with his past, and the other takes place in modern day, or at least modern day 10 years ago. This sees Max going through a legit midlife crisis as he's retired from being a cop. He shaves his head bald, and he goes to be a private, security contractor in South America, and well, he fucks up a lot and has to kill a lot of people, and I'll just leave it at that. I think the story is actually very well done. I don't think it's as good as the original Max Payne story, but I think it is a little bit better than the second games. I think they really understood what made Max Payne, especially when it came with the story, and I think that the way he copes with his past is a lot more believable than it was in the first two games, and it's not to the point where it's almost like a comic book, and it's definitely got that Rockstar influence on it. It certainly has that Rockstar production values, as the game still looks amazing, the voice acting obviously is amazing, the soundtrack is great, everything is just very top quality when it comes to that, and it still looks amazing and plays amazing today. The game is still challenging, and the gunplay is still just as excellent as it always was, and I remember playing this back when it came out, and you know what, even all these years later, still very accessible, very easy to come back to, and is still a great shooter. Nobody's going to deny that Max Payne 3 is not a fantastic shooter. The game is also the longest of the Max Payne games, however, I will say that this is a bit of a cheat because unfortunately you can't skip the cutscenes in Max Payne 3, which really decreases the replay value in my opinion, as there's a lot of moments in this game that are very story heavy, very narrative driven, and if you've already seen it, you kind of just want to get to the part where you're just killing everybody, and this game doesn't really let you do that. It makes you go through the story every single time, so that's definitely a detriment. That and some of these whack ass filters, what the hell is this shit? What is this, 2010? Well, yeah, it is, but still, if you're looking for a violent, gory, dark narrative focused third-person shooter, it doesn't get much more than that with Max Payne 3. Alright, and so here we have Grand Theft Auto 4, released in 2008 for everything at the time. Now, GTA 4 really brought GTA into the HD era, and it changed a number of things for the formula. I'd say the two biggest changes that GTA 4 brought to the formula was that they made it a lot more realistic and heavy, and they actually have a much heavier emphasis on the story and the characters. Now, in the other GTA games, there were a lot of good characters and there was some good writing and some good story, but GTA 4 really hones in on the story, the writing, and its characters to create maybe the strongest cast of characters that the series has ever seen. The story is about Eastern European war veteran Niko Bellic and his attempts to escape his past. He leaves his country and comes to America to live the American dream, as his cousin Roman has said that he's living large in Liberty City. He shows up to find out that Roman is not indeed. And it sees Niko struggling with the idea of the American dream and of course falling into some bad shit and getting involved in some even worse shit. I think Niko Bellic is a really strong character, and I think that his whole character arc in GTA 4 is actually pretty great. The other characters in GTA 4 are also equally great. Roman, his annoying cousin, despite being annoying, is also pretty great, and the people that give you missions in this game, yeah, they're really memorable, and I think the story as a whole is probably the strongest aspect of GTA 4. It was the strongest story by far at the time for GTA games. Now, while I absolutely love the story of GTA 4, when it comes to the gameplay, I don't love it as much. Sure, the formula is generally the same. You have a giant, amazing open world to explore with a ton to see, side missions to do, and a nice storyline to go through. There have been some changes to the overall feel of the game that I'm not a fan of. I know some people really like how this game feels, but I just never have been a fan. Whether I played it back almost 10 years ago or even nowadays, I'm just it's just not the best feel for me. See, this game has a very heavy feel to it. Everything feels a lot more weighted and just kind of rooted in reality. The older GTA games were a lot more arcade and just kind of crazy by comparison. First off, the driving I just feel is nowhere near as great as it was in the older games. It's a lot heavier, the cars feel kind of underwater, and turning in them just feels very slow. The game feels incredibly sluggish when you're driving around. You can get some good speed here, I'm not saying that, and you can actually go pretty fast, but it just doesn't feel that great to me. On foot, it's a pretty similar situation. You move very slow, it feels a bit sluggish and like you're moving underwater. The game introduces a cover system. It's a very good cover system actually, where you can take cover behind basically everything, and the shooting feels a lot more weighted and realistic. It's very heavy and a lot of the shots matter. When it comes to the presentation, this game looked freaking amazing for 2008, but you know what? It can look even more amazing if it didn't have this ugly ass filter on it. Yeah, it has some like 2008 Instagram filter on it, and I do not like this filter at all. There's mods on the PC version that get rid of it, and I think this game looks way better. And then we have the radio stations, which maybe it's just me and my preferences, but I do not like the music in this game. I just never thought it was all that great. Liberty Rock was okay, but the other stations, I was just like, wow, this isn't great. Now I get it, everything I just talked about is subjective, and I'm probably making it sound like I don't love the game. Well, despite my subjective issues with it, I don't think you can deny that the game has some superb missions. It has a ton of memorable set pieces, it has a ton of depth to it. Nico's very customizable, you can get a girlfriend, you talk to people on the phone. I really do actually think the gameplay is still really good. It's just not my preference for GTA. But I still have a ton of great memories with GTA 4, playing it back in the day, really liking the story, and actually really liking the multiplayer. I have a lot of fun memories in the multiplayer. It was really a good time. It's a shame you can't really go online with it anymore. I know I just talked shit about it for 2 minutes, but I still think that this is a great game that is totally worth playing if you like GTA open world games, or if you somehow haven't played it at this point. And so here we have one of my favorites on the list. We have Manhunt, released by Rockstar North for the PS2 in 2003. Manhunt is pretty different from all the other games on this list, minus Manhunt 2, and it's violent. Oh, is it violent. The setup is one of the most twisted setups you'll find in any video game. It's about James Earl Cash, a death row prisoner who is forced to participate in a series of snuff films, earning his freedom by murdering criminal gang members sent to hunt him on camera. Yeah, you're really participating in snuff films, and the people you're killing, these gang members, are not good people. These are some messed up, really messed up, fucked up people. Skinheads, neo-Nazis, cult members, yeah, it's not good people you're killing. You're not a good guy either, but you're better than these people. The story, the setup, and the atmosphere of Manhunt are just fantastic. Like, this game is really gritty, dark, serious. Yeah, it's not messing around, and I really do enjoy the atmosphere. It really does actually have a horror atmosphere, and never has a game been able to recreate this atmosphere, or even anything close to this atmosphere. I know a lot of people consider this game a horror game. I would say it certainly is a psychological horror game because it really just does have such a foreboding atmosphere. But the actual gameplay is pretty solid. And coming back all these years later, yeah, it can be a bit clunky. The controls can be a bit stiff, and it can take some time to get used to it. But once you get over that initial hurdle, I think it's great, and it's much better than the sequel. Most of the game is a stealth game where you're going through these dark urban environments, just hiding in the shadows, basically silently taking out all the other gang members and just trying to get the hell out of there. I think the game's stealth mechanics are actually really good and somewhat underrated. I know a lot of people go, oh, you're just hiding in the dark, but it's actually a lot more than that, and there is a bit of depth here. Additionally, the AI is actually really good in this game. They're really good at spotting you in the dark, they won't mess around, and they're not stupid either. But man, when you're able to sneak up on somebody and perform one of those executions, it is a violent, violent time. Like when you get the plastic bag and you choke someone out, like there's not many games where you can do some messed up crap like that. And you get plenty of different weapons to use in this game. And of course, if you're spotted, you can get into a fist fight or, you know, a melee weapon fight. And these are fine enough. I'm not going to act like it's great. It's probably better than twos, but you really want to avoid these. And then occasionally, you do get firearms and you get into a gunfight. And these honestly aren't that good, but I mean, it's pretty uncommon. A majority of the time you are hiding in darkness, taking people out slowly and going through these really dark, depressing levels, and I gotta say, it's a really good time. Like, I was glued to my seat with just how immersed I was in this game and its mechanics. A lot of the levels are actually really well designed and have a lot of intricate routes and really set up some interesting scenarios for you to go against these messed up individuals. And you know, this game is just unforgettable. It truly is one of those unforgettable games from the 2000s where it's just like, how did they even make this? Like, I get it, they made Grand Theft Auto, but this is way more messed up on so many different levels. But if you can stomach the game's violence, I absolutely recommend you try it. Like, I think it just is, again, an unforgettable experience with an amazing atmosphere, pretty solid gameplay, but it just has so much going for it. So here we have the awesome original Max Payne by Remedy Entertainment. Not only do I think it's the best of the Max Paynes, but it tells such a gripping narrative that is full of so many different emotions, whether it's hate or anger or depression and sadness. Like, I really thought the story of Max Payne was great. The way it was told with these comic book style like screens, I thought was always great. Sure, it does look a bit outdated now and some of the faces look pretty goofy, but the gameplay absolutely holds up and the story is just as impactful now as it was 20 years ago. The story just really involves Max going through a lot of deep shit and a lot of bad stuff. I mean, his whole family was killed. He's trying to deal with his past. He's an alcoholic. He's addicted to painkillers. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on here. It's a lot of baggage to unpack. And, you know, I think it was really well handled. I think the voice acting is excellent. The production value, even back then, the production value was great. And yeah, while the world isn't as interesting as some of these other games like Quantum Break, I still think the story was very well done. But the gameplay is just superb. It is one of the finest third-person shooters you will find from the 2000s, if not of all time. Max Payne was really the game that took that whole Matrix slow-mo jumping into the air and shooting people and it looking awesome into games. And ever since then, there's been tons and tons of games that have copied from this. You just have a complete arsenal of weapons, you take painkillers to heal, and you run around in slow-mo or jumping around in slow-mo, just shooting everyone, gunning everyone down, and it's a great time. The levels are great, the level design is superb, everything makes sense, killing the enemies is extremely satisfying, the AI is pretty alright, and the flow of the game is just great. The general pacing is very well done. It is very cinematic, especially for the time, and the game has a great length to it. It's not too short, it's not too long, and it ends at like the right time. I really enjoyed my time with Max Payne. I think it's a true certified classic. I don't think anyone will deny that. And it's apparently getting a full-blown remake by Remedy sometime in the future, so we'll see how that goes, but you should totally play this. Alright, and so here we got my favorite Midnight Club, Midnight Club 3, one of the greatest racing games ever made. And when it comes to street racing games, it doesn't really get any better than Midnight Club 3. It's fantastic. The story is about as basic as Midnight Club 2. You just really want to be the best and race the Midnight Club people or race the elite people or whatever. The game has San Diego, Atlanta, and Detroit as maps. And there's also Tokyo as a bonus if you have certain versions of the game. Each map feels decently detailed, not as much as LA of course, but it still feels more detailed than Midnight Club 2 with a bunch of nooks, crannies, shortcuts, jumps, etc. And I really did like all three of the maps. I thought they were all pretty good. Tokyo really is the Midnight Club 2 map just thrown in there with some new races, but I mean, I'm not going to count it too much. It's a total bonus and it's not even part of the main story. The game is a pretty decent improvement from Midnight Club 2 and improves on just about everything from Midnight Club 2. The first thing they looked at was the customization, because it was really weak in the first two games. It's really strong in Midnight Club 3. It's not as strong as LA's, but it is actually quite good in Midnight Club 3, and you can get some really cool looking cars here. The vehicle selection is actually quite good in Midnight Club 3, and this game would also bring back all the techniques from 2, including the boost, and would introduce some of the superpowers that would go on to be in LA, and eventually Grand Theft Auto 5, like slowing everything down so you can drive through some of the traffic when you're just going at an insane speed. This game has a very good sense of speed. In fact, it is probably the best sense of speed in maybe the whole series, tied with LA. However, unlike LA, you have that sense of speed almost immediately. Like, even the slowest cars in this game still feel pretty fast, and you still go at a pretty high speed, and the controls are just great. It feels super arcadey still, and the cars can turn on a dime, and I just really had a blast going through this map as fast as possible. There's a lot more variety in the racing as well. There's different types of racing. There's a bunch of side races you can do, side bets you can do. You can make a bunch of money from doing these. The game is probably almost twice as long as Midnight Club 2, and really it's as long as you want it to be, and it doesn't go on too long either since a lot of it is optional. And while the game does get challenging, in fact near the end it gets very challenging, I don't think it gets to Midnight Club 2's level, and I don't think the AI cheat as bad as they did in 2. The rubber banding isn't as crazy and ridiculous here. And the presentation is also very strong. It looks quite a bit better than Midnight Club 2. And it is cool that they tried to add in weather effects like fog and rain, but unfortunately the rain just kills the frame rate in this game, and it makes it way harder when you're driving in the rain. Something about Rockstar Games and rain, I swear, they just can't get it right, any of these games. Then the soundtrack, yeah, the soundtrack is pretty fantastic. It's probably tied with LA for me in terms of which one I like more, but I do love that main theme. Cars real big, house real big, all that stuff. That one's big, that's a good one. But Midnight Club 3 You really can't go wrong with it. It just does everything right for a driving game. If you even casually like driving games, this is just must play. I've always had such a fantastic time with Midnight Club 3. What a great time. And so here we have the absolute fan favorite Bully, developed mostly by Rockstar Vancouver and released for the PS2 in 2006 and then other platforms till about 2008. Now Bully, like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, was actually the last Rockstar game I needed to play, and wow, I really saved one of the best for last because this game was great. I remember people talking about Bully a bunch when I was growing up, but I just never got around to playing it until now. And you know, a lot of people called it GTA for kids, and I kind of agree. It is kind of like a kid version of GTA, but it definitely has its own identity, its own gameplay formats, and a pretty unique story. The player controls Jimmy Hopkins, who is a delinquent who gets sent to this boarding school by his stupid mom and his even stupider stepdad. And he faces a lot of challenges that a kid, you know, going to high school at this time would face. A lot of bullying, a lot of assholes, teachers are terrible, and he's just trying to, you know, get through school and just get along. The story is great. These kids are awful. They are just little dickheads, and Jimmy really does put a lot of them in their place. They really just are terrible human beings in a typical Rockstar fashion, and it's pretty great to see them here also. I really like how the game progresses. I like the gangs, and I really just, again, loved the vibe, the atmosphere, the story, all of it. I thought it was great in Bully. But when you're actually playing the game, it does play a bit like a typical Rockstar game. It is an open world area where you can explore, you can do side quests, you can do the main missions, and you can of course just cause chaos. Obviously it's on a much smaller scale since you are just a high school student, but there really is a lot more to it. You can help other students, you can go to class, you can of course just mess around in the city and do whatever you want. And there are an absolute ton of memorable missions in this game, like dozens of memorable missions where I just can immediately call back to it. I also did just play the game, but I can immediately call back to it. Jimmy has a great arsenal. He has like a skateboard to get around. You can steal bikes. You can use a slingshot. Or you could just be a bully and beat the piss out of everybody. And you know, the combat is actually pretty decent. It's like the Warriors, but it's honestly better than the Warriors. It's a lot smoother, there's more combos, and it feels like a beat 'em up in 3D. I actually thought it was really satisfying, and there's a bit of depth to it. And when you aren't going to class or beating up people, you're exploring the open world, you're seeing what there is to offer. There's a ton of collectibles, there's a bunch of side missions, there's other challenges like races to do, and I actually thought the open world was pretty good. It does seem a bit small at first, but you realize that just because it's a little smaller doesn't mean it isn't full of detail. It really does have a ton of detail to it, and I really could appreciate it. And while we're finishing up here, I'd say the bosses are actually some of the best Rockstar Games has ever made. They're actually pretty good and way better than the Warriors. And then the music, oh my gosh, man, I had no idea how good the music was in Bully. Like, the music slaps so hard, it is so good. I was like, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god. This music is great. Like, I love the music. I thought the presentation was very good. The voice acting was just as good as I'd expected from Rockstar. Bully, there's a reason it's like the fan favorite when it comes to Rockstar games during this period, because it really is fantastic. I have nothing but very high praise and recommendations for Bully. It's just very good in almost every level. It's totally worth playing. Here we got Vice City, released a year after GTA 3. Really looked at GTA 3 and its gameplay and its story and thought, how do we improve on this? How do we make it better? We set it in the 80s, we set it in Florida, and we just kind of expand the gameplay. And with that, I think they created a fantastic game. Vice City has gone on to be one of the fan favorites of the series and a lot of people's favorite like PS2 game of all time, and with good reason. Vice City is just a fantastic game. The game is set in 1986 in the fictional Vice City, based on Miami and Miami Beach. It's about Tommy Vercetti and his rise to power after being released from prison and becoming caught up in an ambush drug deal. While he seeks out those responsible, he slowly actually builds up a criminal empire, taking power from other criminal organizations throughout the city. Tommy is a great character. He's one of the best protagonists of any open world game, let alone the GTA games. The previous protagonist, Claude, really didn't have a personality. He didn't have much going for him. Tommy is the exact opposite. He has a ton of personality and character and charm and wit. He's actually really well written, and there's a lot to him. He doesn't change a ton throughout the game, but you really actually root for this guy. But he isn't the only good character in the game. There's my man Lance, he's pretty good, and then there's a bunch of other quirky, memorable characters that give you missions throughout the game. I think the story of Vice City is just great. Sure, is it a little simple and is it based off Scarface to an extent? Of course, but it's still pretty great, and it still does tell an interesting story that makes you really, again, root for this guy and you want to see what happens. Now, while the core gameplay is still very similar to GTA 3, you have a giant open world to explore and you do a lot of driving and getting into some shootouts, the vibes and the missions are just totally different from GTA 3. Like, Vice City has some of the best vibes you'll find in any PS2 game. You really do feel like you're in, like, Miami Beach. The open world is just completely different from really any other GTA game. There's so much water, there's beach, there's just a bunch to this world. There's a bunch to see, a bunch to explore, and there's a bunch of nooks and crannies. In GTA 3, you couldn't really go in any buildings. In Vice City, you can. And then speaking of buildings, there's actually a whole property system here. Throughout the game, you'll actually acquire a ton of money, and you'll be able to buy businesses. And by buying these businesses, you'll be able to build up Tommy's enterprises. But of course, you're going to have people go after you if you become, a powerful figure. This game has a ton of different gangs in it, and they are way more interesting than GTA 3's gangs. And of course, you're going to get into fights with them. The combat and controls feel a lot better than GTA 3's, especially when it comes to the gunplay. The lock-on is quite a bit better. It's a lot smoother. It actually locks onto what you want. The weapons feel a lot better. They added a bunch of new weapons here. The melee, though... yeah, the melee's still ass, but the controls feel a bit better. You still can't swim, so that sucks. And the driving feels pretty much untouched. A lot of the vehicles feel the same, and the driving, again, still pretty arcade, but it is still good. And then when it comes to the missions, oh, it's so much better than GTA 3. They're a lot more memorable, there's a lot of variety, and it's a lot more than the simple kill someone, run someone over, or chase someone down. There's a ton of different missions here. There's heists, and you get to even control some RC planes and helicopters and things like that. These are terrible, but the ratio of good to bad missions is pretty good. Most of the missions are pretty great, and only a couple of them have aged poorly. This game has actually aged incredibly well in just about every aspect. Sure, it does look a bit blocky, but I mean, you can get over that. And it doesn't matter how old this game is, it's going to have one of the best soundtracks to any video game. It is arguably the best radio stations of any Grand Theft Auto game, and it's one of my favorite soundtracks to any game. Like, it is just fantastic. And the controls, like I mentioned, they've actually aged pretty decently. And yeah, it's just a fantastic game and totally worth playing no matter who you really are. If you like video games, it's, again, totally worth playing. Play the original version, don't play that awful remaster either. And here we have arguably the best Western game ever made, Red Dead Redemption, released in 2010, and this game's great for a number of reasons. The game is fantastic for a number of reasons. It takes place in the early 1910s and sees our protagonist, John Marston, former outlaw turned bounty hunter, and he goes after his old crew. See, the government has taken his family from him and told him that if he wants to see them again, he's going to need to take in his old crew that he used to run with, dead or alive. It certainly lives up to the redemption name, as you really do feel like John is redeeming himself from a life of bad. John himself isn't a great person, but he's a fantastic protagonist. In fact, all the characters are pretty great in this game. They're all trash. Like, everybody is just awful to everybody. And John's old running mates were pretty great here as well. The last hour and a half of the game is the stuff of gaming legends. The story is just incredibly different from basically every other Rockstar Games story, and it's just excellent. It's superbly written, the characters are all great, and there's really just not much to complain about here. The game's presentation is on a similar level, with everyone having just amazing voice acting, and the presentation for 2010 was just excellent. Now, when it comes to the gameplay, I know some people are quick to say, it's just GTA in the Wild Wild West. Well, I don't think it's just GTA in a Western setting. This game is still obviously an open world and plays to a lot of Rockstar's strengths, but it is quite different actually than GTA. Yes, it does take place in an open world, and you can basically do whatever you want. You can either help people, you can do the main missions, you can veer off to the side and do some side content, you can do hunting, or you can just be a complete asshole and start killing everyone and get the cops on you. Yes, there are some similarities to GTA, but at some point every open world game has similarities to GTA. Now, I think the world of Red Dead Redemption, the whole Western setting, and really just, again, how the world was designed, I think is just great. There's a lot of open space, and it definitely feels unique. But the general gameplay loop is pretty simple. You go and talk to an important NPC and they give you a mission. These missions are usually very linear and straightforward, and most of the time involve you getting into a shootout with people. There are plenty of other side missions, but they don't deviate all that much from the main missions, and you aren't just shooting up people, as there are some other objectives that do show up, but yeah, majority of the time you just go somewhere and shoot the place up. When it comes to the gunplay, it is pretty solid. It runs off GTA 4's engine and feels a bit like GTA 4 in terms of movement and controls, but it's nowhere near as slow or heavy, and I didn't get that feeling like I was underwater. No, it felt a lot snappier and quicker. All the weapons are obviously akin with the times, and they all feel really good. They all pack a really good punch. They actually do feel different from each other for the most part, and it is very satisfying to, again, like Revolver, just blow people away with a gun. The game does have Deadeye, and Deadeye is much better and much more satisfying in this game. It is just a blast to just totally own somebody with it. There's actually a pretty good cover system here. It's way better than, say, Revolver's or GTA 4's. I actually quite liked it, and when it comes to Red Dead Redemption being a third-person shooter, I think it's one of the best. I think it's a great third-person shooter. The duels return here from Revolver, and like Revolver, I'm still not very big on them, but they're certainly better here. When you aren't getting into gunfights, you're usually riding your horse all around, and I think riding your horse actually is pretty good in this game. You never ride it for too long, and all the horses feel pretty nice to ride. They can go pretty fast. You even get to do some races with them. Now, while I love Redemption, I'll be the first to admit that it does have some issues. The frame rate can get pretty choppy when things get crazy. There are a number of glitches, and the game did crash on me a few times. But the pacing can be a bit slow. The first couple hours of the game really aren't all that exciting, like when you're herding the cows or just kind of interacting with characters and doing the smaller tasks. You have to wait a little bit for the game to ramp up, and when John goes to Mexico, I really wasn't that big on this area either. Even John himself questions why he's doing this. And of course, like every Rockstar game, there's a couple missions here that I just really am not a fan of. I mean, every Rockstar game has missions that aren't that great, but most of the missions are pretty great here, and the pacing all around is actually really good. The game isn't stupidly long either. It doesn't take forever. It's actually a pretty decent length, about 10 to 15 hours. And the game had pretty great multiplayer. I remember having a lot of fun with it many years ago, and I think the multiplayer was honestly better than Red Dead 2's online. But Redemption really is a fantastic game. It's one of my favorite games by Rockstar and probably one of my favorite games ever. And if you somehow have not played it at this point, you really ought to try it because it's just a great game. And so here it is. Here we have Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, arguably the best game Rockstar Games put out in the 2000s, one of the best GTA games, one of the best games of all time. San Andreas is legendary. It really is era-defining. With San Andreas, I can say the same thing about it that I said about Vice City. They look at the previous game and go, how do we make this even better? And you know what they did? They made just a fantastic game and one of my favorite games of all time. The game is about my man CJ Carl Johnson, who returns home following his mother's murder and is drawn back into his former gang and a life of crime while clashing with very corrupt authorities and just some really evil people. Carl's journey takes him across the fictional US state of San Andreas, which is the setting here. It's based on basically California and Nevada, and it has 3 major cities: Los Santos, which is LA, San Fierro, San Francisco, and Las Venturas, Las Vegas. I love the characters and the setting. I live in California myself. I've been to LA, I live near San Francisco, and I've been to Vegas a bunch, so you knew I was gonna love the setting like immediately. I love all 3 of these cities. They're all great, and this game is so much bigger than how Vice City was. Like, it is way bigger, and there's way more to see and do. And the characters really are just stuff of legends at this point. Like, they're all really great. CJ is a great protagonist, but it's not just him. The other characters are equally as good, like Big Smoke.
2 number 9s, a number 9 large, a number 6 with extra dip, a number 7.
And something I really like about San Andreas' story is that it has really strong antagonists. Like Tenpenny, I really hate Tenpenny, and I think that it has some of the best antagonists in the whole series. Okay, aside from the really awesome story, characters, and setting, we got a pretty great game here. It really does feel very similar to Vice City, but they expand on it in a number of ways. First off, the controls are a little bit better and smoother than Vice City's. The lock-on is even better than it was before. The gunplay is actually pretty satisfying, and the melee combat, well, it's not as awful as before. There's a ton of different weapons to use here, a lot of them being new to the series, and again, it all does feel very nice. It feels really snappy, and it does feel pretty arcade for the most part. Driving feels just as great as ever. They really did try to make some of these cars feel different, which is nice, and I can appreciate that. And on that note, you can actually swim in this game. If you go in the water, you don't die instantly. You can actually swim around. CJ can also climb stuff. I'd say the biggest change to San Andreas from the previous couple games is the level of customization that you have. This game is very customizable. In the old games, you could customize it the most, like what shirt your character's wearing. Here, you can customize everything about CJ, from his hair, how he looks, tattoos, and then they also bring in the role-playing elements. See, CJ has stats. He has stats in areas such as driving, firearms handling, stamina, lung capacity, and of course his hand-to-hand combat. The more you do of these actions, the better the stat gets. For instance, if you drive around a ton, your driving is going to get better. You're going to be able to handle cars better. If you run around a bunch, your stamina is going to get better. If you take CJ to the gym, he'll get fit and big. Or you can have him eat a ton of food and be lazy, and then he'll also get big, but not the kind of big that's muscly. You can even customize how CJ responds to pedestrians. It's not just CJ you can customize, as you can also customize your cars. There is way more vehicles here than any GTA game prior, and you can customize them pretty decently, like Midnight Club. And then there's all the gang activities. The gang stuff has been really expanded on from Vice City. You can actually take over territories, and you gotta protect your territory from other gangs. You don't have to do any of this, but it's fun. And then of course there's the main storyline to play through, and I think the main storyline's pretty great. It might be the longest of the GTA games. It has the most missions, and these missions are incredibly varied. They're all really different from each other, and so many of them are just memorable. And of course a ton of them have a decent amount of challenge, like the train. Some of my favorite missions of any video game are in San Andreas, like where you steal the jetpack or you do the heist on the casino. Like, I think all of these are just great. Sure, there's a bunch of missions here that are shit, I won't lie to you. A lot of the missions in San Fierro are not very good, especially anything involving drones. Like, these have just not ever been good in Rockstar Games. But for the most part, it feels like almost legendary after legendary mission, with so many good ones. And then the presentation was pretty good for the time as well. It does get really blurry on the PS2, and their frame rate isn't the best, but if you play like any other version other than the shitty remaster, it's fine. And the soundtrack, oh, it is so good. And the radio stations, oh my god, I could be here all day. I could really be here all day. I just love it. San Andreas also has the best cheats, easy. San Andreas is such a legendary game. It's probably my favorite PS2 game, like, of all time. Seriously, it's that good. And if you somehow haven't played it, I mean, you're the one missing out. I definitely think it should be tried out by legit everyone. And here is Red Dead Redemption 2, one of the most critically acclaimed games of all time, and I don't even know what to add to the conversation at this point. Red Dead Redemption 2 is just one of the very best open world games, and arguably one of the best games ever made. It does so many things right, and while it does do some things that I'm really not a fan of and I know a lot of people don't like, it just does so much right still. And I think most people can agree at the very least that the game has an insane amount of detail to not only its open world, but its story, its characters, and really just about everything. This is an incredibly detailed, rich experience. Now, when it comes to the story, I really do have the highest, and I do mean the highest praise for its story, its characters, how the characters develop, the writing, the world, the voice acting and direction of the voice actors. Like, it is just fantastic stuff. It is superb stuff here. The game is a prequel to Red Dead 1 and takes place many years before. It's about Arthur Morgan. He's in the Vanderlyn gang run by Dutch Vanderlyn, a group of infamous outlaws who have basically been run out of most of the country for just committing crime, and they're trying to get one last big score and then escape the law. Along the way, they gotta deal with those Pinkertons and those goddamn O'Driscolls. But there is a ton of more issues besides those two, and the story just has so many layers to it. And Arthur Morgan, I got nothing but amazing things to say about Arthur Morgan. He is the best character Rockstar Games has ever made, from the writing to how deep his character is, how he changes throughout the game. His entire arc is just phenomenal. The story would be great without him, but with him it just becomes amazing. And sure, there are some people that don't love the story a ton and they go, oh, it's just a prequel, we know what's going to happen if we played the first game. And yeah, that's a fair point, but I just really loved the story and I really love what happens, and I just really was engrossed the whole time by it. It is easily my favorite aspect of the game, is the story, the characters, the world, all of that. It is just so good. When it comes to the gameplay, it's very similar to the first game, but heavily, and I mean heavily, expanded on. Obviously the game is much larger, much longer, with a ton more detail to it. But yeah, it still is an open world game where you explore around this huge world, you interact with NPCs, you do missions for them, you do some side missions, and get into a ton of shootouts. This game has a bunch of other side activities besides shooting people though. Whether you're playing poker or one of the other table games or you're hunting, there's just an endless amount of variety to do in this game when it comes to its side missions, and there's just so much to see in this open world. It really is easy to get lost and engrossed and just have a great time. But when you are shooting people, it's pretty great. The shooting feels superb. It's the best that any Rockstar game has probably felt in terms of controls, only matched with GTA 5. It feels really snappy. It's really satisfying. A lot of the weapons feel very different. There's a good range of weapons here. And yeah, the way you kill people, it's pretty great. There's a lot of impact, they react accordingly, and there's a significant amount of weight here. It's just very satisfying. Now, when you aren't shooting people up, you're probably riding your horse. Your horse has like this whole system behind it where you get to customize it and take care of it and groom it, and yeah, it's actually pretty cool and it's pretty different from most other games. There's even the Vanderling camp where you can upgrade it and help out its people and learn more about them and do some side missions, and while you don't ever have to actually help the camp, I think it's actually pretty cool and it does add to the game. Now, all in all, Red Dead 2, it really is a great game and the story is fantastic, but there are a couple issues I have with this game. And it's these issues why sometimes I really do prefer Red Dead 1, and I do prefer Red Dead 1's simplicity over 2. The story in Red Dead 2 is great. The pacing, though, is not. This game is incredibly slow with its pacing. The first, 5 hours of the game are very slow. And everything feels incredibly drawn out. Everything feels like it just goes on a little too long, and I wasn't a fan of Guarma at all. And speaking of drawn out, I think the game honestly is too long. I think it goes on much longer than it should have. I mean, the game took well over 40 or 50 hours to finish, and I just don't think it needed to go that long. I think it can get a bit repetitive because it's so long. And I think most people can agree that, yeah, it's a little too long. I know a number of people that just never finished the game because they were like, I put 30 or 40 hours and I'm still not done, I'm just going to drop it, which is unfortunate, but that is the case with such a long game. And I know a number of people dislike a lot of the realistic elements of this game, and I kind of dislike it too. I think that a lot of it is unnecessary, and it's also very inconsistent with its realism. And there are plenty of videos that go over this in much more depth, like Nakey Jakey, who I recommend. I'm just going to say the realism is inconsistent, and I think there's just way too much horse riding. It shouldn't take you 5 to 10 minutes to go from location to location. It just takes too long, and a lot of the game is just kind of boring horse riding. It's fine for the first couple hours, then you realize 30, 40, 50 hours in, you're still just doing basic horse riding. Yeah, it just goes on too long. But aside from the length and the pacing, I mean, it's still a great game. There's also the RDR2 online, known as Red Dead Online, but I never got into this at all. I thought it was really grindy. I didn't like the microtransactions, and it seems to be basically dead at this point in terms of updates. There's plenty of people still playing it, but it just never stuck with me. Single player's pretty great, though. It's one of the most detailed open worlds ever with a fantastic story, great gunplay, and while it does have some issues, it still is one of my favorite games of all time, and I still really do love the characters. I know some people in the comments are probably going to be debating whether Red Dead 1 or 2 is better, but on this day I'm choosing Red Dead 2. Either way though, both are fantastic games, both are definitely worth experiencing, and some of Rockstar's best. Come on, did you really think it was going to be something else? Really? Did you really think it was going to be a game that wasn't GTA 5? Of course it's GTA 5. It's not even like a game anymore, it feels like a dynasty. It's just taken over, and it's taken over not only Grand Theft Auto, but Rockstar Games as a whole. And really, at this point, what is there left to say about Grand Theft Auto 5 that hasn't already been said? Whether it is the amazing story, the great characters, the excellent writing, the really good attention to detail, or just the awesome single player, or now the really expansive, extensive multiplayer that is GTA Online, Grand Theft Auto 5 has just become one of the very best games ever created, and it's clearly one of the most successful games ever made as well. It has it all, and I remember when this game came out, it had a stupid amount of hype behind it. Everybody at school was talking about, everybody was talking about it, because when it came out, it just blew people's minds. It was the next Grand Theft Auto, and it was maybe the best campaign of them all. The game takes place in San Andreas, mostly Los Santos though, and it's about 3 different characters coming together. It's about retired bank robber Michael DeSanta, street gangster Franklin Clinton, and drug dealer / gun runner Trevor Phillips, and their attempts to commit heists while under pressure from a very corrupt government agency and some evil people. When it comes to the story, the characters, the writing, the world, all of it, it's just beyond fantastic. Like, it really is some of Rockstar Games' best. I know I've said that a bunch in this video, but it really is just fantastic when it comes to the characters and the writing and how they act. They have so much depth to them. They're also interesting, and they all have really good backstories. They all go through really interesting arcs also. All of these characters are just really great, and it's not just the main three that are great, but the villains are really good, and then all the other side characters are just great. Like my man Lamar, he's awesome.
I'll see you at work. Oh, nigga, don't hate me because I'm beautiful, nigga. Maybe you got rid of that old yee-yee ass haircut you got, you get some bitches on your dick. Oh, better yet, maybe Tanisha will call your dog ass if she ever stop fucking with that brain surgeon, the lawyer she fucking with, nigga. What?
No, this game has become very iconic in pop culture for a number of different reasons, but one of the biggest reasons is the characters and the story. Like, it's just fantastic.
Sweet Jesus.
The hell are you doing?
Oh, nothing.
Are you taking a dump?
Why do you care, huh?
The fuck is wrong with you?
I got abandonment issue.
There's really not a bad character here. Like, they're just all really well done. The world is really well done. There's just so much detail to this world. Like, in old games, you know, there was a fair amount of detail to the open world, but here, like, everything is incredibly detailed. You can go in so many buildings, and there's just so many little weird quirks and details, and there's just a ton to see here. It certainly has the biggest and most interactable open world that the series has ever seen, and it's one of the best open worlds in any video game ever, if not like just straight the best. Now, one of the key reasons this is my favorite GTA is because of how the game feels, how it handles, and how it controls. It is just basically perfect. It takes that overly realistic style of GTA 4 and kind of meshes it with San Andreas to get something in between that just feels excellent. It feels snappy, but it also feels fast and somewhat rooted in reality. It's not slow either. It just has a really great feel to it, whether you're running around or whether you're driving in the cars. It just all feels so awesome. Taking cover feels great. The gunfights are great. It is the best shooting that the series has ever seen, if not Rockstar Games in general. There's a ton, and I mean a ton of different weapons here, and there's plenty to take cover behind. You can take cover behind everything again. The handling of the vehicles is just superb. A lot of them feel really different, and no two vehicles feel exactly the same, and it's all just really good. It's like they took the excellent driving of Midnight Club and put it in here. Speaking of taking elements from their other games, every character has a special ability. So Michael has slow-mo, where it's like Max Payne. Trevor has rage mode, where it's just a rage mode, I guess. And then Franklin has slow-mo that is just straight ripped from Midnight Club, so you know Franklin's is my favorite because I love me some Midnight Club, but I really did like all the abilities, and I really loved how engaging this game was. Its open world is fantastic, and there's a ton of side stuff. And the campaign, the main missions anyway, is just legendary. They're almost all really good, like really, really good. A lot of them are easily the best missions that the GTA series has ever seen. There's only like a couple, maybe a handful at most, of missions that aren't very good, and even at their worst, I think they're just like okay. Seriously, like all the missions are really well thought out, and they're all really good. Some of the set pieces are really great too. Some of the best set pieces the series has ever seen. I know some people don't like that it's a lot more restrictive and linear than older GTA games, but I mean, it does create a more cinematic experience, but yeah, it is very linear. I can say it's a stark contrast to the actual game where it's so open, and then you have these really linear missions. Either way, it's still really great, and then the presentation is just fantastic. It looked great 10 freaking years ago, and it still looks great nowadays. The radio stations are all great. I don't know if I love it as much as San Andreas or Vice City, but it's still really great also. There's a lot of variety. Pretty much what anyone's looking for in music is here when it comes to the stations. They're all really good. And then there's GTA Online. Now, GTA Online, we'd be here all day if I talked about it, and it's microtransactions, and it's, yeah. Look, I never really got into GTA Online. They deleted my character one too many times with their server issues. I think it's pretty cool how extensive there is to it. I know a lot of people are really sick of it, myself included, but hey, it's there, it's a bonus. I wasn't really including it too much here. I just love the campaign of GTA 5. I think it's amazing, but the online is a little bonus there. Hopefully Rockstar can finally stop fucking around with GTA Online and give us GTA 6. But that's it for this video, everyone. It was a really long video, long time in the making. I love Rockstar Games. Despite everything they do nowadays, I still love them to death, and I will play every game that Rockstar Games touches in some way. If I see that logo, I expect greatness, and I know we're going to get greatness because GTA 6 is coming. I mean, we all know it now. There was that major leak, which unfortunately kind of spoiled their surprise, but you know, we're getting GTA 6, so that's all I really care about. I can't wait to play it when it comes out, and that's really it for this video. If you made it to this part, comment cement. I'd love that, but I mean, I don't blame you if you didn't make it to this video. There was a lot of repeated stuff, but you know, that's just how it goes. I feel the same way that I did a little bit ago. I love just about every game on this list, and I think that almost every game is worth checking out. This is going to be my last video on Rockstar Games for quite some time. I don't see really another list to make. I've talked about all their games pretty extensively at this point, like legit all of their games, and so with that in mind, I guess this is the end of a short era for myself where I talked about all of Rockstar's games. All these games really do mean something to me. I've grown up with a lot of them. I had never tried some of them before this video, but now I'm pretty deeply familiar with all of them, so I guess that is pretty cool. Hope everyone has a great day. See everyone